Chapter 1. Sleepless Nights and Secret Maps. Harry Potter could have slept. It would have been the sensible thing to do. Tomorrow's Transfiguration exam loomed like a thundercloud, and McGonagall had made it abundantly clear that turning a hedgehog into a pincushion was not optional learning. But sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant the hooded figures gliding across the Hogwarts grounds, their rattling breath sucking the warmth from his bones until he woke gasping and drenched in sweat. The dormitory was quiet, except for Ron's gentle snoring and Neville's occasional whimper. Even Neville's dreams seemed more peaceful than his own. Harry lay still for another few minutes, staring at the bed curtains that blocked out the January moonlight, before admitting defeat. His scar didn't hurt, exactly, but there was a persistent ache behind his eyes that made rest impossible. He slipped from bed with the practiced silence of someone who had been making midnight excursions for the past 2 months. His bare feet found the cold stone floor, and he padded over to his trunk, careful not to step on the loose floorboard that always creaked. The Marauder's map lay folded beneath his invisibility cloak, both gifts that had transformed his 3rd year in ways the givers never could have intended. Fred and George had pressed the blank parchment into his hands with identical grins, their eyes bright with mischief. "This little beauty's taught us more about Hogwarts than 4 years of lessons," George had said. "Bit of a shame to give it up, really," Fred had added, though neither twin had looked particularly regretful. They'd been more interested in Harry's gratitude than in keeping their secret weapon. Harry touched his wand to the parchment and whispered the words that still felt like a small rebellion. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." Lines of ink spread across the surface like veins, forming the familiar layout of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Tiny labeled dots moved through corridors and rooms, each one representing a person going about their midnight business. Mrs. Norris prowled the 3rd floor, her owner thankfully nowhere nearby. Nearly headless Nick drifted through the Gryffindor common room. Professor McGonagall's dot rested motionless in her chambers. Even she had to sleep eventually. And there, in the depths of the dungeons, was the dot labelled Severus Snape. Always awake, that one. Always watching. Harry wondered if Snape ever slept, or if he simply stood in his office all night, waiting for students to break curfew so he could assign detention. Harry folded the map carefully and tucked it into his dressing-gown pocket, along with his wand. The invisibility cloak settled over his shoulders like water, and the familiar sensation of becoming nothing more than air and intention filled him with a comfort that had nothing to do with magic. Under the cloak, he wasn't Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the boy whose godfather was a convicted murderer. He was just another shadow in a castle full of them. The thought of Sirius Black hit him like a physical blow, the way it always did when he wasn't prepared for it. 3 months since Black's escape from Azkaban, and Harry still couldn't reconcile the stories he'd heard with the strange, desperate longing he felt whenever the name was mentioned. A murderer. A traitor. A man who had sold Harry's parents to their deaths and then laughed about it. And yet, when the Dementors had closed in on the Quidditch pitch, when their cold had wrapped around him like grave earth, and their rattle-breath had filled his ears, he had heard his father's voice, not screaming, as he'd always imagined, not begging for mercy or crying out in pain, but strong and defiant. "Lily, take Harry and go. It's him. Go, run, I'll hold him off." His father had died protecting them, died buying time for his wife and son to escape, though escape had proved impossible. There had been love in that voice, not fear. Love and fierce determination, the sound of a man who would die before he let harm come to his family. How could Sirius Black have betrayed that? How could anyone who had truly known James Potter have sold him to Voldemort for any price? Harry pushed the questions away. They led nowhere except to more sleepless nights and more doubts about things everyone assured him were settled fact. Black was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The entire wizarding world agreed. Harry's strange reluctance to believe it was just another mark of how little he understood about the adult world, another sign of his naivety. He made his way through the castle with the ease of long practice, keeping to the shadows even beneath the cloak. The map showed him clear paths and warned him of approaching professors or prefects. But he'd learned that caution was still necessary. Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye could see through invisibility cloaks, and while Mad-Eye wasn't at Hogwarts, Harry had no idea what other magical senses might be lurking in the castle's ancient stones. The kitchens were his favourite destination on these midnight walks. The house elves were always pleased to see him, their enormous eyes lighting up with genuine joy whenever he appeared. They never asked why he was awake, never made him feel guilty for wandering the halls when he should be sleeping. They simply pressed warm food into his hands and chatted about their work, treating him like a welcome guest rather than a rule-breaking student. "Harry Potter!" squeaked a familiar voice as he slipped through the hidden entrance behind the fruit bowl portrait. Dobby the house elf came hurrying over, his tennis ball-sized eyes bright with pleasure. "Harry Potter has come to visit!" The other house elves looked up from their late-night preparations. Tomorrow's breakfast bread was rising in enormous bowls, and someone was stirring what looked like enough porridge to feed half the castle. They bobbed respectful curtsies and bows before returning to their work, but their pointed ears remained tilted in Harry's direction. "Hello, Dobby," Harry said, settling onto a low stool beside the great fireplace. The warmth felt wonderful after the cold corridors, and he pushed back his hood to better enjoy it. Couldn't sleep again. "The young master is troubled," Dobby said, with the shrewd understanding that always surprised Harry. For all his squeaky enthusiasm, Dobby saw more than most people gave him credit for. Dobby can see it in Harry Potter's eyes. Dark thoughts they are. "Just thinking about things," Harry said. It wasn't quite a lie. He was thinking, even if those thoughts led nowhere useful. School things. Exam things. Dobby tilted his head, clearly not fooled, but he didn't press. Instead, he bustled away and returned with a plate of still warm biscuits and a mug of cocoa that steamed invitingly in the firelight. Harry accepted both gratefully, letting the simple domestic comfort ease some of the tension from his shoulders. "Is Harry Potter learning much from his map?" Dobby asked casually, polishing a spoon that was already gleaming. Harry nearly choked on his cocoa. "My what?" "The map that shows the castle, of course," Dobby said, as if it were perfectly obvious. "The map the Weasley twins gave Harry Potter. Dobby has seen many students use such things over the years." "You know about the map?" "House elves see everything, Harry Potter. We clean the dormitories, we tend the fires, we know when young wizards cannot sleep." Dobby's enormous eyes were kind. "The map is very old magic, very clever, but maps only show what is, not what should be." There was something in the way Dobby said it that made Harry pause with a biscuit halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" But Dobby had already turned away, busying himself with organizing a stack of plates that were already perfectly organized. "Dobby says too much sometimes," he muttered. "Young Harry Potter must learn his own lessons." Harry finished his cocoa in thoughtful silence, watching the flames dance in the great hearth. The house elves worked around him with quiet efficiency, their magic making light work of tasks that would take human servants hours to complete. There was something soothing about their purposeful activity, the way they moved through familiar routines with complete confidence in their roles. When he finally stood to leave, Dobby pressed a small package of biscuits into his hands. "For the journey back," the elf explained. "And Harry Potter, be careful with old maps. Sometimes they show things that raise more questions than they answer." The warning followed Harry through the empty corridors as he made his way back to Gryffindor Tower. The fat lady was snoring gently in her frame, and Harry had to poke her several times before she woke enough to let him through. The common room fire had died to embers, casting everything in a dim red glow that made the familiar space seem strange and otherworldly. He climbed the stairs to his dormitory slowly, suddenly exhausted in the way that only came after hours of restless worry. Ron was still snoring, though he'd somehow managed to kick off all his blankets. Neville had gone quiet, his face peaceful in sleep. Even Seamus and Dean seemed to be resting easily, their breathing deep and regular. Harry settled back into his own bed and pulled the hangings closed, cocooning himself in familiar darkness. The map crinkled softly as he shifted it back to its hiding place beneath his pillow, and Dobby's words echoed in his mind. Maps only show what is, not what should be. Tomorrow night, he thought drowsily, he might explore a different part of the castle. The map showed dozens of rooms he'd never visited, secret passages he'd never walked. Maybe he'd finally work up the nerve to check the areas around Dumbledore's office, though he'd avoided that part of the castle since getting the map. Something about spying on the headmaster felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. Of course, Harry had no way of knowing that tomorrow night, that very reluctance would crumble in the face of a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about his world. For now, he simply closed his eyes and hoped for dreamless sleep, unaware that his quiet midnight wanderings were about to become something far more dangerous than a remedy for insomnia. Chapter 2. The Name That Shouldn't Exist. Harry had intended to sleep. He'd closed his eyes, pulled his blankets up to his chin, and tried to will himself into the dreamless rest his body desperately needed. But sleep remained elusive, dancing just beyond his reach like a snitch in a strong wind. Every time he began to drift off, his mind would jolt awake with some new worry. Tomorrow's Transfiguration exam, the upcoming Quidditch match against Hufflepuff, the persistent ache behind his scar that never quite went away. By 2:30 in the morning, he admitted defeat. This time he moved with less caution than usual, his frustration making him careless. Ron's snoring provided adequate cover as he retrieved the map and cloak from their hiding place, and within minutes he was padding barefoot through the corridors of Hogwarts, his invisibility cloak billowing around him like captured shadow. The castle felt different tonight, more restless, as if the very stones were shifting uneasily in their ancient foundations. Harry had been wandering these halls for months now, and he'd developed an instinct for the building's moods. Some nights, Hogwarts felt welcoming, almost protective, its corridors warm despite the January cold. Other nights, like tonight, it felt watchful and secretive, full of whispers that died when he tried to listen for them. He paused in an alcove between two empty classrooms and spread the Marauder's map across his knees, touching his wand to the parchment. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." The familiar web of lines spread across the surface, but tonight Harry found himself studying it with unusual intensity. Dobby's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. Maps only show what is, not what should be. The elf had seemed to be warning him about something, though what, Harry couldn't imagine. He traced the corridors with his eyes, following the movement of the tiny labelled dots. Mrs. Norris was on the 5th floor tonight, probably lying in wait for some unfortunate student. Professor McGonagall's dot rested motionless in her chambers. She'd been keeping later hours recently, grading essays by lamplight until well past midnight. Even Peeves seemed to be taking a break from his usual midnight mayhem, his dot hovering near the trophy room, where he'd probably been polishing the awards to an obnoxious shine. Harry's gaze drifted across areas of the castle he rarely examined closely. The staff quarters were always interesting. He'd learned that Professor Flitwick often worked late into the night, tiny movements suggesting he was grading papers or practicing complex charms. Professor Sprout spent considerable time in the greenhouses even after hours, tending to plants that required midnight care. And Snape? Snape's dot was moving through the dungeons with its usual predatory precision, probably prowling for students foolish enough to break curfew. Harry had learned to track the potions master's movements carefully. Snape had an uncanny ability to appear exactly where he wasn't wanted, as if he could sense rule-breaking through the very stones of the castle. But tonight, something drew Harry's attention higher up on the map, to an area he typically avoided examining too closely. The headmaster's office sat near the top of the castle, accessible through a spiraling staircase that required a password to activate. Harry had only been there a handful of times, usually when he was in serious trouble or when Dumbledore wanted to share some cryptic piece of wisdom that left Harry more confused than enlightened. The office area was clearly marked on the map, though it was smaller than Harry had expected. Apparently, the vast circular room he remembered was only part of a larger suite of chambers. He'd never really studied this section before. Something about using the map to spy on Dumbledore had felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. Tonight, however, his eyes were drawn to the area almost against his will. Perhaps it was his restless mood, or perhaps it was simple curiosity about what the headmaster did during the small hours of the morning. Did Dumbledore sleep? Did he spend his nights reading, or brewing mysterious potions, or corresponding with his network of contacts throughout the wizarding world? Harry leaned closer to the map, squinting at the tiny text that marked the office area. There, in the circular chamber, he recognized as Dumbledore's study was a familiar dot. Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster was awake, as Harry had somehow expected. The old man seemed to require less sleep than normal people, as if age had refined his need for rest down to the bare minimum. But there was another dot in the office, a second name, written in the map's careful script right beside Dumbledore's. Peter Pettigrew. Harry stared at the words for a long moment, certain he was seeing things. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the name remained, as clear as any other on the map. Peter Pettigrew was in Dumbledore's office at 2:30 in the morning, apparently having a conversation with the headmaster himself. Peter Pettigrew, who was supposed to be dead. Peter Pettigrew, who had supposedly been murdered by Sirius Black 12 years ago, blown to pieces along with 12 innocent muggles on a crowded London street. Peter Pettigrew, whose heroic confrontation with the traitor Black had left nothing behind but a finger and a stain on the cobblestones. Harry's hands began to shake. He set the map down on the stone floor and pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to think clearly through the sudden roaring in his ears. This had to be a mistake. The map must be malfunctioning somehow. Perhaps the magic was old, perhaps the ink was fading, perhaps he was reading the name wrong in the dim light filtering through the castle's windows. But even as he tried to convince himself of these possibilities, Harry knew they were false. The Marauder's map didn't make mistakes. Fred and George had told him as much, their voices full of pride, as they'd explained how their little beauty had never led them astray. The map showed what was really there, no matter how impossible it might seem to the observer. He picked up the parchment again with trembling fingers and read the name once more, letter by letter. P-E-T-E-R-P-E-T-T-I-G-R-E-W. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The man who was supposed to be dead was sitting in Dumbledore's office in the middle of the night, apparently alive and well, and engaged in conversation with the most powerful wizard in Britain. Harry's mind raced through everything he'd been told about that terrible night 12 years ago. Sirius Black, secret keeper to the Potters, had sold Harry's parents to Voldemort for reasons no one had ever adequately explained. When the deed was done, and James and Lily Potter lay dead in Godric's Hollow, Peter Pettigrew, brave, loyal Peter Pettigrew, had confronted the traitor in a London street. Black had laughed as he'd blown up half the street with a single curse, killing Pettigrew and 12 innocent bystanders, leaving behind only a crater and a finger that had been identified through magical means. The story had never quite made sense to Harry, not completely. Why would Sirius Black, who had supposedly been James Potter's best friend, betray him to Voldemort? What could the Dark Lord have possibly offered that would be worth more than the life of his closest companion? And why had Pettigrew confronted Black so publicly, in broad daylight, on a street full of witnesses? It seemed like the action of a desperate man rather than a calculating hero. But everyone told the same story. The Ministry, the Daily Prophet, every adult who had known his parents, they all agreed that Sirius Black was a traitor and Peter Pettigrew was a martyr. Harry's own doubts had seemed like childish wishful thinking, the product of a boy who wanted so badly to believe that someone from his parents' generation might still be alive and innocent that he was willing to ignore obvious facts. Except now, staring at the map in the dim corridor, Harry realized that maybe his doubts hadn't been so foolish after all. If Peter Pettigrew was alive, if he was sitting in Dumbledore's office at this very moment, then everything Harry had been told was a lie. If Pettigrew hadn't died that day in London, then what had actually happened? Had the explosion been staged? Had the finger been placed there deliberately? Had Pettigrew faked his own death to escape justice for some crime Harry didn't yet understand? And if Pettigrew was alive, then what did that mean for Sirius Black? Harry watched the map with growing intensity, afraid to blink in case the impossible names disappeared. But they remained steady, 2 dots in the circular chamber, apparently engaged in quiet conversation. Occasionally, one or both of the dots would shift slightly, as if pacing or moving to different chairs, but neither showed any sign of leaving. As Harry watched, something else began to bother him. If Peter Pettigrew was alive, and if Dumbledore was meeting with him secretly in the middle of the night, then the headmaster had to know that Pettigrew was alive, had to know that the official story was false, had to know that Sirius Black might be innocent of at least some of the crimes laid at his feet. The implications made Harry's stomach twist with nausea. Dumbledore, the man everyone trusted, the leader of the Light, the wizard who had defeated Grindelwald and stood against Voldemort. If he knew that Pettigrew was alive, then why hadn't he said anything? Why was Sirius Black still a fugitive, still hunted by Dementors, still believed by the entire wizarding world to be a dangerous murderer? Harry stared at the map until his eyes burned, willing the names to change, to resolve into something that made sense. But they remained stubbornly present. Albus Dumbledore and Peter Pettigrew, together in the headmaster's office at 3 in the morning, discussing matters that apparently couldn't wait for daylight. Then, abruptly, both dots began to move. Harry leaned closer, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the 2 names leave the circular office and make their way toward what looked like a balcony or external doorway. They paused there for several minutes, long enough for Harry to wonder if they were saying goodbye, or if Pettigrew was receiving final instructions, or if something else entirely was happening that he couldn't begin to guess at. Then Peter Pettigrew's dot simply vanished, not moved to a different part of the castle, not shifted to an adjacent room, gone completely, as if he had never existed at all. Harry frantically scanned the entire map, searching every corridor and chamber, every secret passage and hidden room. But there was no trace of the man who wasn't supposed to be alive. Dumbledore's dot, meanwhile, remained on the balcony for another minute before slowly returning to his office. The headmaster's movements seemed unhurried, almost casual, as if midnight meetings with supposedly dead men were perfectly routine. Harry sat in the empty corridor for a long time after that, the map spread across his lap, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Everything he thought he knew about his parents' death, about Sirius Black's guilt, about the night that had shaped his entire life, all of it was suddenly called into question by 2 names on a piece of magical parchment. Peter Pettigrew was alive. Dumbledore knew it. And somehow, Harry was certain that this knowledge was the key to understanding everything else that had never quite made sense about that terrible Halloween night 12 years ago. His hands were still shaking as he whispered, "Mischief managed," and watched the lines of ink fade from the parchment. But the memory of those two names burned in his mind with perfect clarity, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Tomorrow he would have to decide what to do with this terrible, wonderful, devastating knowledge. Tonight, all he could do was make his way back to Gryffindor Tower on unsteady legs, knowing that his world had just shifted on its axis in ways he was only beginning to understand. Peter Pettigrew was alive, and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 3. Questions without answers. Harry had never understood how people could function normally while carrying devastating secrets. Now, sitting in Transfiguration class the morning after his discovery, he felt as though everyone in the room should be able to see the knowledge burning behind his eyes like a fever. Professor McGonagall's voice seemed to come from very far away as she demonstrated the proper wand movement for turning a hedgehog into a pincushion, and Harry found himself staring at his own hedgehog without any memory of how it had gotten there. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall's sharp voice cut through his fog. "Perhaps you could demonstrate the transformation for the class." Harry blinked, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was on him. His hedgehog sat motionless on his desk, still very much a hedgehog, while around him his classmates had produced various degrees of successful pincushions. Some still had quills instead of pins, others had retained their hedgehog feet, but all showed clear signs of magical transformation. Harry raised his wand, his mind completely blank. What was the incantation? What was the wand movement? Everything McGonagall had just explained seemed to have evaporated from his memory the moment she'd called his name. "Acus," he said, finally, making a vague circular motion with his wand. His hedgehog twitched once and curled into a defensive ball. McGonagall's lips compressed into a thin line. "Perhaps you could favor us with your attention, Mr. Potter, rather than whatever fascinating thoughts have occupied you this morning. The NEWTS examination will not wait for you to daydream your way through the curriculum." Heat flooded Harry's cheeks as snickers rippled through the classroom. He mumbled an apology and tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept returning to those two impossible names on the Marauder's map. Peter Pettigrew, sitting calmly in Dumbledore's office at 3 in the morning. Peter Pettigrew, who was supposed to have been dead for 12 years. The rest of the morning passed in a similar haze. In charms, Professor Flitwick had to repeat his instructions for the cheering charm 3 times before Harry realized he was being addressed. In defense against the dark arts, Professor Lupin's concerned glances made Harry shrink lower in his seat, terrified that the man might somehow read the chaos in his thoughts. It was during lunch that Harry finally found the courage to study Dumbledore directly. The headmaster sat at the center of the high table as always, his long silver beard flowing over his purple robes, his half-moon spectacles glinting in the afternoon light, streaming through the great hall's enchanted windows. He appeared perfectly normal, serene, wise, occasionally leaning over to murmur something to Professor McGonagall that made her smile. Nothing in his demeanor suggested that he had spent the previous night in secret conference with a man the entire wizarding world believed to be dead. But now that Harry was looking for it, he began to notice things that had never struck him before. The way Dumbledore's eyes occasionally swept the room, not with the benevolent attention of a grandfather watching his students eat, but with the calculating assessment of someone monitoring a situation. The way he sometimes paused mid-conversation, as if listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. The way his fingers drummed silently against the table, not the absent gesture of an old man lost in thought, but the precise, measured tapping of someone keeping time with a rhythm only he could perceive. "Harry!" Hermione's voice interrupted his observation. "Are you feeling all right? You've been staring at the staff table for 10 minutes. Harry jerked his attention back to his friends, suddenly aware that his scrutiny might have been obvious to others. "Just thinking about something Dumbledore said to me once," he lied, cutting a piece of shepherd's pie he had no intention of eating. "What did he say?" Ron asked through a mouthful of potato. Harry's mind scrambled for a believable response. Just something about how people aren't always what they seem. How sometimes the truth is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. It wasn't entirely a lie. Dumbledore had said similar things to him over the years, usually wrapped in the sort of cryptic language that left Harry more confused than enlightened. But now, those conversations took on a different cast. Had the headmaster been trying to prepare him for revelations like this, or had he been deliberately obscuring truths that Harry had a right to know? "That's very philosophical for lunch conversation," Hermione observed, giving him a searching look. "You've seemed distracted all day. Did you sleep badly again?" The irony of the question almost made Harry laugh aloud. Sleep had been the last thing on his mind when he'd discovered Peter Pettigrew's name on the map. "Something like that," he said. After lunch, Harry excused himself and made his way to the library. If he was going to investigate this impossible situation, he needed to start with facts, or at least with the official version of events that everyone seemed to accept without question. The library's newspaper archives were comprehensive, dating back over a century. Harry pulled every daily prophet from October and November 1981, spreading them across a table in a secluded corner where Madame Pince's sharp eyes couldn't monitor his reading too closely. The headlines brought back familiar stabs of pain. "Potter family murdered. Boy who lived survives killing curse. Dark Lord vanquished." But Harry forced himself to read past the sensationalism and focus on the details. The story of his parents' deaths was consistent across multiple issues. James and Lily Potter had been betrayed by their secret keeper, Sirius Black, who had sold their location to Voldemort in exchange for... what exactly? Harry realized that none of the articles actually explained Black's motive. The betrayal was described as fact, but the reason remained mysteriously vague. "For reasons that remain unclear," seemed to be the standard phrase, as if Black's motivation was less important than his guilt. But it was the coverage of Peter Pettigrew's death that made Harry's stomach clench with growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. The initial reports, published just days after the incident, were surprisingly sparse. "Ministry hero dies confronting traitor," read one headline, followed by a brief account of how Pettigrew had cornered Sirius Black on a London street and died in the resulting explosion. But the details were frustratingly vague. No witnesses were quoted by name. No specific location was given beyond a busy London street. Even the number of Muggle casualties varied between reports. Some said 12, others 13. One mentioned more than 10. Harry pulled later editions, looking for follow-up coverage, and found something that made his blood run cold. An article dated 2 weeks after the incident bore the headline, "Pettigrew Memorial Service attended by ministry officials." The accompanying photograph showed a small gathering of wizards and witches around what appeared to be an empty grave. There was no coffin, the article explained, because the heroic Aura's sacrifice left no remains to be buried. No remains. No body. No physical evidence that Peter Pettigrew had actually died, beyond the word of the ministry officials who had investigated the scene. Harry sat back in his chair, his heart hammering, as the implications sank in. If there had been no witnesses to the actual confrontation and no body recovered afterward, then how could anyone be certain that Pettigrew had actually died? The explosion was real enough. Muggle authorities had confirmed that much, and the street had indeed been destroyed. But if someone wanted to fake a death, causing a large explosion and claiming the victim had been vaporized would be an effective way to do it. "Researching your family history?" Harry spun around to find Professor Lupin standing behind him, a stack of books balanced in his arms. The defense professor's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a sharpness that hadn't been there during class. "Professor," Harry said, quickly shuffling the newspapers into a pile, "I was just curious about what really happened that night. I don't remember much, obviously. It's natural to want to understand your past, Lupin said quietly. He set his books down on a nearby chair and glanced at the papers Harry had been reading. Though I'm not sure the Daily Prophet is the most reliable source for that particular story. Something in his tone made Harry look up sharply. What do you mean? Lupin was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. The Prophet has always had a complicated relationship with the truth, Harry. They tend to report what their readers want to hear, rather than what actually happened. And in the case of your parents' deaths... He paused, then shook his head. Perhaps this is a conversation for another time. No, Harry said quickly. Please, I need to understand. But Lupin was already gathering his books. Some truths are more dangerous than ignorance, Harry. Be careful what questions you ask, and be even more careful who you ask them to. He paused at the end of the table. Your father was my friend. If I thought you needed to know something to keep yourself safe, I would tell you. But some knowledge comes with a price that's higher than you might want to pay. He left without another word, leaving Harry alone with his growing pile of newspapers and a certainty that everyone around him was keeping secrets. Lupin's warning had been meant kindly, but it only reinforced Harry's determination to find the truth for himself. He spent another hour combing through the archives, looking for any mention of witnesses, any detail that might contradict the official story. What he found instead were small inconsistencies, reports that didn't quite match, timelines that shifted between accounts, quotes attributed to ministry sources that were never identified by name. By the time he returned to Gryffindor Tower, Harry's head was spinning with questions and his notebook was filled with contradictions. He found Ron in the common room, wrestling with what appeared to be a potions essay, while Scabbers sat on his shoulder, occasionally nibbling at his ear. Ow! Ron swatted at the rat irritably. Stop it, Scabbers. You've been acting mad all week. He looked up as Harry approached. I swear this rat's losing his mind. Yesterday I caught him trying to eat my transfiguration notes, and this morning he bit me when I tried to feed him. He's never been like this before. Harry stared at the grey rat perched on his friend's shoulder. Scabbers looked ordinary enough, small, slightly mangy, with black eyes that seemed unusually intelligent for a rodent. But as Harry watched, the rat turned its head and looked directly at him. And for just a moment, Harry could have sworn he saw something deeply human in those dark eyes, something afraid. How long have you had him? Harry asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Years and years, Ron said absently, returning to his essay. He used to be Percy's, but Percy got an owl when he made prefect. Scabbers is ancient for a rat, really. Mum keeps saying he should have died ages ago, but he just keeps going. He paused, frowning. Though he has been acting strange lately, almost like he understands what we're saying sometimes. Harry felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. An old rat who had belonged to Percy Weasley. A rat who seemed to understand human conversation. A rat who was acting increasingly nervous and afraid, as if he sensed that his secret was about to be discovered. Ron, Harry said slowly, when exactly did your family get Scabbers? Ron looked up, surprised by the question. I don't know exactly. He's been around forever. Why? Just curious, Harry said. But his mind was racing. If Peter Pettigrew was alive, if he had faked his death and gone into hiding, what better place to hide than as a pet rat in a wizarding family? He would have access to information about the wizarding world while remaining completely invisible. And if that family happened to have connections to Harry Potter, the implications made him feel sick. How long had Pettigrew been living with the Weasleys? How much had he overheard about Harry's life, his plans, his fears? Had he been reporting back to someone? To Voldemort, perhaps? Or to whoever else was involved in this conspiracy? But as Harry watched Scabbers, he noticed something else. The rat wasn't just acting nervous, he was acting terrified. His tiny paws kept twitching, and his eyes darted constantly toward the exits, as if he was calculating escape routes. This didn't look like the behavior of a confident spy. This looked like the behavior of someone who knew he was in terrible danger. That night, Harry lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through everything he had learned. Peter Pettigrew was alive. He was certain of that now. The rat sitting on Ron's bedside table was almost certainly more than he appeared. Dumbledore knew the truth and was keeping it secret for reasons Harry couldn't begin to fathom. But what was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Confront Dumbledore directly? The headmaster would probably deny everything, or worse, he might simply wipe Harry's memory of the entire incident. Tell Ron that his beloved pet was actually a supposedly dead wizard who might be a Death Eater? Ron would think he'd lost his mind. No, Harry decided, as he finally drifted toward sleep. He needed more evidence. He needed proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. And most importantly, he needed to understand why this conspiracy existed in the first place. If Peter Pettigrew was alive and Sirius Black was innocent, then everything Harry thought he knew about his parents' death was wrong. And if Dumbledore was keeping those secrets, then Harry could no longer trust the man he had always believed was protecting him. Tomorrow, he would begin looking for the truth that everyone else seemed determined to hide. And this time, he wouldn't stop until he had answers that actually made sense. Chapter 4. The Rat's Strange Behavior. Harry had never paid much attention to Ron's rat before. Scabbers had always been just another fixture of life at Hogwarts, like nearly headless Nick, or the suits of armor that lined the corridors, present, unremarkable, and easily ignored. But now, as Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room, pretending to read his charms textbook, he found himself watching the small grey creature with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. Scabbers perched on the arm of Ron's chair, occasionally grooming his whiskers with tiny paws that seemed far too dexterous for a normal rat. Every few minutes the creature would pause in his cleaning and scan the room, his black eyes moving with what looked suspiciously like human awareness, rather than the simple alertness of an animal checking for predators. "You're staring at my rat," Ron observed without looking up from his potions essay. "It's getting weird, Harry." Harry forced himself to look down at his textbook, though the words about cheering charms might as well have been written in ancient runes for all the sense they made. "Just thinking about something Professor Kettleburn said in Care of Magical Creatures," he lied, "about how some animals are more intelligent than they appear." "Scabbers is definitely smarter than the average rat," Ron agreed, scratching the creature behind the ears. "Remember when he bit Goyle last year? Right after Goyle called me a blood traitor. It was like he understood every word." Harry's blood went cold. He looked up sharply, but Ron had already returned to his essay, apparently unaware of the significance of what he'd just said. If Scabbers had understood Goyle's insult well enough to react with anger, then the rat possessed far more than animal intelligence. That night, Harry made another trip to the library, this time seeking information about animagi rather than newspaper archives. The section on magical transformations was tucked away in the library's depths, surrounded by books on advanced transfiguration theory that made Harry's head spin. But the basic information about animagi was clear enough, even if the magical theory behind the transformation remained largely incomprehensible. An animagus, Harry learned, was a witch or wizard who had mastered the art of transforming into a specific animal form at will. The transformation was incredibly difficult to achieve and required years of study and practice. More importantly, every animagus was required by law to register with the Ministry of Magic, providing details about their animal form, identifying markings, and personal information. According to the book Harry was reading, there had been only 7 registered animagi in the entire 20th century. 7. In a century of magical progress and education, only 7 witches and wizards had successfully completed the transformation and registered themselves with the authorities. But the book also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that unregistered animagi were not unheard of. The process of registration was voluntary in theory, though mandatory by law, and some wizards chose to keep their abilities secret. These illegal animagi were difficult to detect unless they chose to reveal themselves, and the Ministry's methods for identifying them were limited at best. Harry closed the book with shaking hands. If Peter Pettigrew was an unregistered animagus, if he had mastered the transformation into a rat, then faking his death would have been absurdly simple. Stage an explosion, leave behind a finger, easily accomplished with a simple cutting charm, and then transform into rat form and disappear into the crowd. No body to examine, no magical signature to trace, no evidence except what the investigators chose to see. And what better place to hide than as a pet in a wizarding household? Rats lived for only a few years normally, but a human mind in rat form could extend that lifespan indefinitely through careful use of magic. He would be invisible, protected, and perfectly positioned to gather information about the wizarding world's activities. The next morning, Harry began his observations in earnest. During breakfast, he watched as Scabbers nibbled delicately at a piece of bacon Ron had given him. Normal rats, Harry knew, would devour food with the desperate hunger of creatures that never knew where their next meal was coming from. Scabbers ate with the measured precision of someone accustomed to regular meals, someone who knew that food would always be available. In Transfiguration class, Harry noticed that Scabbers, who was sleeping in Ron's pocket, seemed to wake up whenever Professor McGonagall mentioned anything about human transformation. The rat's whiskers would twitch, and his head would tilt toward the sound of her voice with unmistakable attention. But it was during defense against the dark arts that Harry decided to test his theory directly. Professor Lupin was discussing the various ways dark wizards attempted to hide their identities, including the use of Polyjuice Potion and illegal animagus transformations. Scabbers sat on Ron's desk, apparently dozing in the warm afternoon sunlight, but Harry could see that the rat's breathing had changed. Where before it had been the quick, shallow respiration of a small animal, now it was slower, more controlled, more human. Of course, Lupin continued, some of the most notorious criminals in wizarding history have been unregistered animagi. The ability to change forms at will makes them nearly impossible to track. His eyes swept the classroom, lingering for just a moment on Harry. Peter Pettigrew, for instance, was rumoured to have been working toward animagus transformation before his death, though he never completed the process. Harry watched Scabbers carefully as Lupin spoke the name. The rat went completely still, not the natural stillness of a sleeping animal, but the frozen alertness of someone who had just heard their own name spoken aloud. His tiny claws dug into the wooden desk, and his ears flattened against his head in what looked remarkably like fear. "That's interesting," Harry said loudly, causing several students to turn toward him. "I wonder what form Pettigrew would have taken if he'd completed the transformation. Probably something small and cowardly, don't you think?" Ron looked at him strangely. "Why would you wonder about that?" But Harry wasn't looking at Ron. He was watching Scabbers, who had begun to tremble, actually tremble at Harry's words. The rat's black eyes were fixed on Harry with an expression of pure terror, and his tiny body was pressed flat against the desk as if he were trying to make himself invisible. "Just curious," Harry said, keeping his voice casual, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "I've been reading about animagi lately. Did you know that someone who transforms illegally might choose a form that lets them hide in plain sight? Like a common house rat, for instance." Scabbers made a small, strangled sound that was definitely not a normal rat noise. Ron glanced down at his pet with mild concern, but Harry saw something else entirely. The creature staring back at him had human understanding in its eyes, human fear, human desperation, and human recognition of being discovered. After class, Harry lingered in the corridor while Ron packed up his things, waiting for the perfect moment to conduct one more test. "Ron," he said, as his friend shouldered his bag, "didn't you say Scabbers used to belong to Percy?" "Yeah, for years," Ron replied, settling the rat on his shoulder. "Why do you keep asking about him?" "Just wondering how old he really is. Rats don't usually live very long, do they?" Ron frowned, considering the question. Well, Scabbers has been in our family for... let me think. Percy got him in his first year, so that was 7 years ago. Maybe 8. He looked down at the rat with new interest. Blimey, that is old for a rat, isn't it? Most of them die after 3 or 4 years. 8 years. Harry's mind raced through the implications. If Scabbers had joined the Weasley family 7 or 8 years ago, that would place his arrival sometime around 1985 or 1986, several years after Peter Pettigrew's supposed death, but perfectly timed for someone who had needed a few years to recover from faking his own murder and plan his next move. "Where did Percy get him?" Harry asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Pet shop in Diagon Alley, I think, though Mum always said he was probably too old even then. The shopkeeper practically gave him away for free." Ron scratched behind Scabbers' ears, apparently oblivious to the way the rat flinched at his touch. "Funny, really. Most people want young pets, but Percy said he felt sorry for the old fellow." A pet shop in Diagon Alley. A convenient place for a desperate man to blend in among the other animals, waiting for some kind-hearted family to take him home. And what family could be better than the Weasleys? A large, loving household full of children who attended Hogwarts and were connected to everyone in the wizarding world. A family that would eventually become close friends with Harry Potter himself? That evening, Harry made his most direct test yet. Ron had gone to the bathroom, leaving Scabbers alone on his bed while he finished getting ready for sleep. The other boys in the dormitory were distracted with their own preparations, giving Harry the perfect opportunity for a private conversation. He approached Ron's bed slowly, keeping his movements casual, until he was close enough to speak directly to the rat without being overheard. "Hello, Peter," he whispered. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Scabbers jerked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his tiny body convulsing with what looked like panic. He scrambled backward across the bedspread, his claws catching in the fabric as he tried desperately to put distance between himself and Harry. "I know who you are," Harry continued in the same quiet whisper. "I saw your name on the Marauder's map. I know you're alive." Scabbers made a sound that was almost like a whimper, a distinctly human sound of distress that no normal rat could produce. His black eyes were wide with terror, and he was shaking so violently that Harry was afraid he might have a heart attack. "Why?" Harry asked, leaning closer. "Why did you betray them? Why did you let Sirius Black take the blame for what you did?" But at the mention of Sirius's name, Scabbers went completely berserk. He began running in frantic circles on the bed, squeaking in high-pitched distress calls that sounded almost like screaming. His behavior was so violent and unnatural that Harry stepped back in alarm, afraid that he might have pushed the creature too far. "What's wrong with him?" Ron demanded, returning from the bathroom to find his pet in the midst of what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown. "Scabbers, calm down!" But the rat couldn't be calmed. He continued his frantic circling, his squeaks growing more desperate by the moment. Ron tried to catch him, but Scabbers eluded his hands with the kind of strategic thinking that no panicked animal should possess, darting toward apparent escape routes, using the bed's pillows and blankets as cover, always staying just out of reach. "Maybe he's sick," Dean suggested, looking disturbed by the display. "My Grand's cat acted like that right before she died." "He's not dying," Ron said firmly, though his voice was worried. "Are you, Scabbers? You're just having a bad night." Harry watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. This wasn't the behavior of a sick animal. This was the behavior of a man in the grip of complete psychological breakdown. Peter Pettigrew, faced with discovery after 12 years of hiding, was finally cracking under the pressure of maintaining his deception. As Ron finally managed to capture the trembling rat and wrap him gently in a towel, Harry felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. Scabbers was Peter Pettigrew, the man who had betrayed his parents to Voldemort and allowed his best friend to take the blame. The rat who had been living in this very dormitory, sleeping mere feet from Harry's bed, listening to his conversations and watching his life unfold. The betrayer of the Potters had been hiding among them all along, and only Harry knew the truth. But what was he supposed to do with that knowledge? How could he possibly explain to Ron that his beloved pet was actually a Death Eater who had been spying on them for years? How could he prove something so impossible without sounding completely insane? As Harry lay in bed that night, listening to Ron whisper soothing words to his still trembling rat, he realized that he had never felt more alone. The most dangerous secret in the wizarding world was sleeping just a few feet away, and he was the only person who knew it. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to act on his knowledge or continue gathering evidence. But tonight, all he could do was lie awake in the darkness, knowing that everything he had believed about his parents' death was a lie, and that the truth was far more terrible than he had ever imagined. Chapter 5. Hermione's Dangerous Discovery. Harry had never been particularly good at keeping secrets from Hermione Granger. Her analytical mind seemed to automatically detect inconsistencies in behavior, gaps in logic, and the telltale signs of someone trying to hide important information. Over the past 3 days, as Harry had grown increasingly certain about Scabbers' true identity, he'd watched Hermione's sharp eyes track his every mood change, his distracted responses in class, and his newly obsessive interest in Ron's rat. It was only a matter of time before she confronted him directly. The opportunity came on a quiet Saturday afternoon when Ron had gone to Quidditch practice, and the Gryffindor common room was nearly empty. Harry sat by the fire, ostensibly working on a potions essay, but actually watching Crookshanks, who was crouched behind an armchair with his yellow eyes fixed intently on something near the boys' dormitory staircase. "Harry," Hermione said, settling into the chair across from him, with a stack of books that seemed far too heavy for weekend reading. "We need to talk." Harry's stomach clenched. "About what?" "About whatever's been eating at you for the past week," she said bluntly. "You've been distracted in every class. You keep staring at Ron's rat like it's about to perform Shakespeare. And yesterday I caught you taking notes during Professor Lupin's lecture on animagi detection methods. Either you're planning to become an animagus yourself, which would be illegal and dangerous, or you suspect someone else of being one." There was no point in pretending ignorance. Hermione had clearly already worked out the basic shape of his suspicions. The question was how much he could tell her without sounding completely insane. "If I told you something that sounded impossible," Harry said carefully, "would you at least listen to the evidence before deciding I'd lost my mind?" Hermione's expression grew serious. "That depends on how impossible we're talking about. Are we discussing the merely unlikely, or are we venturing into the realm of complete fantasy?" "Somewhere in between, I think." Harry glanced around the common room to make sure they were truly alone, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "What if I told you that someone we see every day isn't who they appear to be? Someone who's been living a lie so complete that even they might have started to believe it?" "I'd ask you to show me your evidence," Hermione said without hesitation. "And I'd remind you that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof." Harry had been hoping for exactly that response. He reached into his bag and pulled out the notebook he'd been carrying for the past few days, pages filled with observations about Scabbers, timeline inconsistencies from the Daily Prophet archives, and questions that had no satisfactory answers in the official record. "3 nights ago," he began, "I saw something on the Marauder's map that shouldn't have been possible." He told her everything. The midnight discovery of 2 names in Dumbledore's office, his research into Peter Pettigrew's supposed death, the inconsistencies in the newspaper coverage, and his growing certainty that Scabbers was far more than he appeared. Hermione listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never dismissing his claims outright. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at his notebook with the intense concentration she usually reserved for particularly challenging orithmancy problems. "Show me," she said finally. "Show you what?" "The evidence. If Peter Pettigrew is alive and masquerading as Ron's rat, then there should be observable proof beyond your intuition. She stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. Physical evidence, behavioral patterns, historical inconsistencies that can be verified independently. Harry felt a surge of relief, so powerful it made him dizzy. Hermione hadn't dismissed him as delusional or suggested he see Madame Pomfrey for a psychiatric evaluation. Instead, she was approaching his claims with the same methodical analysis she brought to every academic challenge. "Let's start with the timeline," Hermione continued, pulling out a fresh piece of parchment. "If Pettigrew faked his death in 1981 and joined the Weasley family several years later, we should be able to establish when Scabbers first appeared and whether that timing matches your theory." They spent the next hour combing through every detail Harry could remember about Ron's stories of his pet. Scabbers had belonged to Percy first, acquired during his first year at Hogwarts. Percy had gotten him from a pet shop in Diagon Alley, where the shopkeeper had been eager to find a home for an older rat that no one else wanted. The timing worked perfectly. 1987, 6 years after Pettigrew's supposed death. Plenty of time for a desperate man to recover from faking his own murder and plan his next move. "That's circumstantial," Hermione said, though her voice carried a note of unease. "Suggestive, but not conclusive." "There's more," Harry said. He opened his notebook to a page covered with behavioral observations. "Watch Scabbers sometime when people are talking about the war, or Voldemort, or anything connected to the Death Eaters. He doesn't react like a normal rat would. He reacts like someone who understands every word and has personal knowledge of the events being discussed." Hermione frowned. "I'll need to observe this myself before I can—" She broke off as Crookshanks suddenly darted across the common room, his bottle-brush tail standing straight up in aggressive alarm. The cat skidded to a stop at the base of the boys' staircase, where Scabbers had apparently been descending, and began yowling with the kind of fury that suggested he'd encountered a mortal enemy. "Crookshanks!" Hermione called, but the cat ignored her completely. He was crouched low, his ears flattened against his head, making the sort of threatening sounds that cats reserved for creatures they considered genuinely dangerous. Scabbers, meanwhile, had gone completely rigid on the stairs. The rat was pressed flat against the stone step, trembling with what looked like absolute terror. But it wasn't the natural fear of a small animal confronted by a predator. It was the specific, targeted terror of someone who had been recognized by an enemy. "That's unusual," Hermione said slowly, watching as Crookshanks began stalking up the stairs with obvious predatory intent. Crookshanks is normally quite gentle with small animals. He's never shown this level of aggression toward a rat before. "What if he's not seeing a rat?" Harry suggested quietly. "What if cats can sense things that humans can't? What if Crookshanks knows exactly what Scabbers really is?" Hermione stared at the confrontation unfolding on the stairs, Crookshanks advancing with deadly purpose, while Scabbers cowered in what appeared to be psychological collapse rather than simple animal fear. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than skeptical. "There are documented cases of cats detecting magical deception," she admitted. "They're sensitive to glamours, polyjuice transformations, and other forms of concealment magic. If Scabbers were maintaining an animagus transformation, Crookshanks might very well be able to sense the human consciousness beneath the rat exterior." Before either of them could say anything else, the portrait hole swung open, and Ron clattered through, still carrying his Quidditch gear, and looking thoroughly windblown from practice. "Bloody hell!" he exclaimed, taking in the scene on the stairs. "Hermione, control your cat. He's terrorizing Scabbers." "Crookshanks, come here," Hermione called, though her voice lacked its usual authority. The cat reluctantly retreated from the stairs, but continued to watch Scabbers with unblinking hostility. Ron scooped up his trembling rat and cradled him protectively against his chest. "It's all right, Scabbers. The mean kitty won't hurt you." He shot an accusing look at Hermione. "You need to keep him away from my rat. This is the 3rd time this week he's gone after Scabbers like this." "The 3rd time?" Harry and Hermione said simultaneously. Ron looked between them, apparently puzzled by their intense interest. Yeah, ever since Christmas break ended. Crookshanks keeps stalking Scabbers like he's planning to murder him. It's not normal cat behavior. It's like he's got a personal grudge or something. Harry and Hermione exchanged a loaded glance. If Crookshanks had been targeting Scabbers specifically since the beginning of January, it meant the cat's suspicions had developed around the same time as Harry's discovery on the Marauder's map. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. After Ron had taken Scabbers up to the dormitory and disappeared into the bathroom to shower off the mud from Quidditch practice, Hermione turned to Harry with an expression of growing alarm. "We need to research the Potter family betrayal more thoroughly," she said quietly. "If your theory is correct, if Peter Pettigrew is alive and Sirius Black is innocent, then we're dealing with a conspiracy that goes far deeper than just one man faking his death." They returned to the library that evening, this time focusing on the specific details of how the Potter family had been betrayed to Voldemort. The information was surprisingly scarce in the public record. Most sources simply stated that Sirius Black had been the secret keeper for the Fidelius charm that protected the Potters' home, and that he had revealed their location to the Dark Lord. But Hermione's research skills were considerably more advanced than Harry's, and she knew how to access historical records that weren't available in the standard library collection. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a ministry document from the restricted archives that she probably wasn't supposed to have access to. This is the official report on the Fidelius charm investigation. According to the Auror who examined the magical signature, the charm was modified just days before the Potters' deaths. Harry leaned over her shoulder to read the dense legal language. "Modified how?" "The secret keeper was changed," Hermione said, her voice tight with excitement. "The original charm had one magical signature, but the final version shows a different caster. Someone performed a secret keeper transfer just before Halloween 1981. Harry's mind raced through the implications. So Sirius wasn't the original secret keeper? According to this, no. The original magical signature is unidentified, but the transfer was completed by... Hermione paused, checking the document again. By someone using Peter Pettigrew's magical signature. He was the one who performed the final secret keeper charm. The pieces clicked together in Harry's mind with awful clarity. Sirius Black had never been the secret keeper at all. Peter Pettigrew had been given that role at the last minute, probably as part of some desperate plan that had gone horribly wrong. When Voldemort came for the Potters, it was Pettigrew who had given up their location, not because he was forced to, but because he had chosen to betray them. But if Pettigrew was the traitor, Harry said slowly, why did everyone believe Sirius was guilty? Because Pettigrew told them so, Hermione replied grimly. Think about it. After the Potters were killed, Pettigrew was the only surviving witness to what had happened. He could have told the Ministry any story he wanted, and they would have believed him, because he was supposedly the victim of Sirius's attack. Harry felt sick. The scope of the deception was staggering. Not only had Peter Pettigrew betrayed his parents to Voldemort, but he had then framed his best friend for the crime and faked his own death to escape justice. And somehow, Dumbledore knew the truth, but was keeping it secret. Harry, Hermione said quietly, if everything we've discovered is true, then Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 12 years for a crime he didn't commit. And Peter Pettigrew has been living as Ron's pet, potentially gathering information about you and reporting back to whoever he's really working for. The thought made Harry's stomach churn. How much had Pettigrew overheard about his life, his plans, his fears? Had he been reporting Harry's whereabouts to Voldemort all along? Was that how the Dark Lord had always seemed to know where to find him? There's something else, Hermione continued, her voice troubled. If Dumbledore knows that Pettigrew is alive and Sirius is innocent, why hasn't he done anything about it? Why would he allow an innocent man to remain in prison while a traitor lives free? Harry had been dreading this question, but he knew he had to share his suspicions with her. "I think Dumbledore wanted Sirius in Azkaban," he said quietly. "I think he needed me to stay with the Dursleys, and Sirius being free would have complicated that." Hermione stared at him in shock. "Harry, that's a serious accusation. You're suggesting that Dumbledore knowingly allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned to serve his own purposes." "I know how it sounds," Harry said. "But think about it. If Sirius had been free, he would have demanded custody of me. He's my godfather. He has legal rights. But with him in Azkaban as a convicted murderer, there was no one to challenge the Ministry's decision to place me with my relatives." The implications hung in the air between them like a poisonous cloud. Hermione, who had always revered authority figures and trusted in the wisdom of adults, was visibly struggling with the possibility that Dumbledore, the man they all looked up to as the leader of the light, might be capable of such calculating manipulation. "We need proof," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If we're going to make accusations this serious, we need evidence that can't be denied or explained away. Evidence that proves Peter Pettigrew is alive, that Sirius Black is innocent, and that Dumbledore knows the truth." "How do we get that kind of proof?" Harry asked. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the table. When she looked up, her expression was grim but determined. "We force Pettigrew to reveal himself," she said. "We create a situation where he has to choose between maintaining his disguise and protecting his own life. And we do it in a way that leaves undeniable evidence of his true identity." Harry felt a chill of anticipation mixed with terror. They were talking about confronting one of Voldemort's followers, a man who had murdered 12 people and betrayed Harry's parents to their deaths, but they were also talking about freeing an innocent man and exposing a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the wizarding world. "It's dangerous," Hermione continued, as if reading his thoughts. "If we're wrong about any of this, we could be putting ourselves and others at serious risk. But if we're right, and we do nothing—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "How can we let Sirius Black rot in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit? How can we let Peter Pettigrew continue to spy on us and potentially endanger everyone we care about?" Harry looked at his best friend, brilliant, logical, cautious Hermione Granger, and saw the same determination that had driven him through his lonely nights of investigation. She had examined the evidence, weighed the possibilities, and reached the same terrible conclusion he had. They were no longer dealing with suspicions or theories. They were dealing with facts that demanded action. "Tomorrow we talk to Ron," Harry said. "He deserves to know the truth about what he's been living with. And then we decide how to expose Peter Pettigrew without getting ourselves killed in the process." Hermione nodded grimly. Tomorrow everything changes. They packed up their research in heavy silence, both acutely aware that they had just committed themselves to a course of action that would either reveal the truth or destroy their lives. But as they made their way back to Gryffindor Tower through the dark corridors of Hogwarts, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. He was no longer alone with his terrible knowledge. He had an ally, a brilliant and determined ally, who would help him navigate the dangerous path ahead. For the first time since he'd seen those two impossible names on the Marauder's map, Harry allowed himself to believe that the truth might actually see the light of day. Chapter 6. The Memory Charm Evidence. Harry had never realized how much of what he knew about his parents' deaths came from second-hand sources until he and Hermione began systematically questioning people who had actually lived through those events. It was a delicate process. They couldn't simply ask direct questions about Peter Pettigrew or Sirius Black without raising suspicions, but Hermione had devised a clever approach disguised as research for a history of magic project on personal accounts of the First Wizarding War. Their first interview was with Percy Weasley, who had been old enough in 1981 to understand what was happening and young enough to remember the details clearly. "The whole wizarding world was terrified," Percy said, settling into a chair in the empty common room, with the self-important air of someone who enjoyed being consulted as an authority. You know who was at the height of his power, and people were disappearing every week. When the news came that the Potters had been murdered and you'd somehow survived, Harry, it was like the sun coming out after the longest night in history. What do you remember about the people involved? Hermione asked casually, her quill poised over her parchment. The ones who were caught afterward, I mean. Percy's expression darkened. Sirius Black, you mean? Terrible business, that. He'd been James Potter's best friend, according to my father, which made his betrayal even more shocking. And poor Peter Pettigrew, dying the way he did, trying to bring Black to justice. He shook his head sadly. My parents always said Pettigrew was a true hero, facing down a madman in broad daylight like that. Do you remember anything specific about what happened? Harry asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Like, did your parents ever mention any details about the confrontation? Percy frowned, his brow creasing in concentration. Well, I remember Father coming home from the ministry that day, absolutely shattered by the news. He kept saying it was impossible to believe that Black had seemed so loyal, so devoted to his friends. And Mother, he paused, looking troubled. Mother said something odd that day. She said it didn't make sense, that Peter Pettigrew would never have confronted anyone directly. Said he'd always been the type to hide behind stronger personalities. Harry and Hermione exchanged a quick glance. But then she changed her mind? Hermione prompted. A few days later, yes. She said she'd been wrong, that grief sometimes made people braver than they'd ever been before. Percy's frown deepened. Actually, now that I think about it, both my parents seemed to change their minds about several things during that period. They went from questioning the official story to accepting it completely, almost overnight. After Percy left, Harry and Hermione sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. That's the third inconsistency we've found, Hermione said finally, checking her notes. First, Kingsley Shacklebolt mentioned that he'd initially doubted Black's guilt, but couldn't remember why. Then Angelina Johnson said her older sister had sworn that Pettigrew was too cowardly to confront anyone, but later insisted she'd been mistaken. And now Percy's parents apparently had the same experience. It's like people's memories were adjusted, Harry said slowly, like someone went around and made sure everyone remembered the story the same way. Hermione nodded grimly. Memory modification on that scale would require considerable skill and resources. It's not something that could be done by a single person, even someone as powerful as Dumbledore. That afternoon, they made their way to the library's restricted section, where Hermione had discovered several advanced texts on memory magic during her previous research sessions. The books made for disturbing reading, detailed discussions of how memories could be altered, suppressed, or entirely fabricated, along with the subtle signs that such modifications might leave behind. Look at this, Hermione said, pointing to a passage in Advanced Memory Manipulation, Theory and Practice. It says that when memories are modified on a large scale, there are often traces left behind in magical photographs and portraits. The magic used to alter human memory doesn't affect inanimate magical objects the same way. Harry felt a spark of excitement. So if we looked at photographs from that time period, we might be able to see evidence of what really happened. Theoretically, yes. Magical photographs capture not just visual information, but emotional resonance and magical signatures. If the people in the photos had their memories altered, the photographs might show their original reactions rather than their modified ones. They spent the next hour collecting every photograph they could find from the Daily Prophet's coverage of the Potter family murders and the subsequent investigation. Most showed the aftermath of the explosion in London, a crater in the street, ministry officials examining the scene, crowds of concerned witches and wizards being held back by aura barriers. But it was the group photographs that proved most revealing. Harry, look at this one, Hermione said, spreading a large photograph across their table. It showed a group of Order of the Phoenix members at what appeared to be James and Lily Potter's funeral, their faces grave with mourning. "Do you see anything odd about how the people are positioned?" Harry studied the photograph carefully. Most of the mourners were clustered together in the way that people naturally gathered during times of grief, seeking comfort in physical proximity, sharing their sorrow. But there were gaps in the formation, spaces where people seemed to be unconsciously avoiding certain areas. "It's like there's someone missing," Harry realized. "Look at how Remus Lupin and Professor McGonagall are standing. There's a gap between them that's exactly the right size for another person, and Hagrid keeps glancing to his left, as if he's expecting to see someone there." "Exactly." Hermione pointed to several other similar gaps in the arrangement. "It's as if Peter Pettigrew was standing right there among them, but he's been completely erased from the photograph. Not just cropped out, magically removed, so thoroughly that even the positioning of the other people was altered to hide the evidence." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. The level of magical sophistication required for such precise editing was staggering. This wasn't the work of a single wizard acting alone. It required coordination, resources, and access to the most advanced magical techniques available. "There's more," Hermione continued, pulling out another photograph. "This one shows the Ministry officials who investigated the explosion site. Look at Minister Millicent Bagnold's expression." In the photograph, the former Minister for Magic stood beside the crater where Peter Pettigrew had supposedly died, but her face showed none of the grim satisfaction that would be expected from someone who had just seen justice served. Instead, she looked deeply troubled, almost ill, as if she were being forced to participate in something that went against her conscience. "And here," Harry said, finding another image. "Look at this picture of Cornelius Fudge. He's barely visible in the background, but he's taking notes and whispering to someone off camera. Why would a junior ministry official be so involved in a case that should have been handled by the Aura department?" Hermione leaned closer to examine the photograph. Fudge wasn't supposed to become minister for another 10 years. In 1981, he was just a mid-level bureaucrat in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. There's no reason he should have been anywhere near this investigation. But there he was, in photograph after photograph, always hovering at the edges of the official proceedings, always taking notes, always whispering to people whose faces were conveniently turned away from the camera. He wasn't just observing, Harry realized. He was coordinating, making sure everyone stayed on message, that all the stories matched up properly. The implications made Harry feel sick. If Cornelius Fudge had been involved in covering up the truth about Peter Pettigrew's death from the very beginning, then his current position as Minister for Magic took on a sinister, new significance. The man who was now in charge of the entire wizarding government had helped orchestrate one of the greatest injustices in recent magical history. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, "there's something else we need to discuss. Something about your own memories." Harry looked up from the photographs, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What do you mean?" "Think about what you actually remember from that night. Not what you've been told happened, not what you've read in books or heard from adults. What you personally remember experiencing." Harry tried to focus on his earliest memories, searching for any trace of that terrible Halloween night. But there was almost nothing there, just fragmentary impressions of green light, a woman screaming, and an overwhelming sense of loss that he'd carried with him for as long as he could remember. "I don't remember much," he admitted. "Just flashes, really." "Why?" "Because you were 15 months old when it happened," Hermione said gently. "Old enough to retain some emotional impressions, but far too young to form coherent narrative memories. Everything you think you know about that night, every detail, every sequence of events, came from other people telling you what happened." The realization hit Harry like a physical blow. He had always assumed that his fragmentary memories were simply the result of trauma and the passage of time. It had never occurred to him that he might not have any real memories of the event at all. that everything he thought he knew was based on stories told to him by adults who might have had their own reasons for shaping his understanding of the past. So when Dumbledore told me about my parents' sacrifice, when he explained about the love protection, Harry trailed off, the implications spreading through his mind like poison. It might all be true, Hermione said quickly. The magical protection is real. We know that from direct evidence. But the details of how it happened, why it happened, who was responsible, she shrugged helplessly. We only have the word of people who may have been involved in covering up the truth. That evening they returned to the restricted archives with a new focus, examining the official ministry records of Sirius Black's arrest and imprisonment. What they found there was perhaps the most disturbing revelation yet. "Harry!" Hermione whispered, her voice tight with outrage. "Sirius Black never had a trial." Harry looked up from the document he'd been reading, a report on the magical cleanup required after the London explosion. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. There's no record of a trial, no transcript of proceedings, no list of evidence presented, or witnesses called. Sirius Black was arrested on November 1st, 1981, and transferred directly to Azkaban the same day. No due process, no legal representation, no opportunity to present a defense." Harry stared at her in shock. "But that's impossible. Even in the wizarding world, people have the right to a trial before they're sent to prison. Apparently not if the minister signs an emergency detention order," Hermione said, holding up another document. "Look at this. Minister Bagnold authorized Black's immediate imprisonment in the interests of public safety and national security." The order was countersigned by... She paused, checking the signature. "By Cornelius Fudge, acting on behalf of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes." There it was again. Fudge's involvement in every aspect of the case, far beyond what his official position should have warranted. The man who was now Minister for Magic had been instrumental in ensuring that Sirius Black never had the chance to defend himself against the charges. "This is bigger than we thought," Harry said, staring at the documents spread across their table. "It's not just Dumbledore keeping secrets, or even Peter Pettigrew hiding in plain sight. This goes all the way to the top of the ministry. Multiple people had to be involved in arranging this cover-up." Hermione nodded grimly. "Memory modifications for dozens of witnesses, magical photograph editing, suppression of evidence, denial of due process, coordination with multiple government departments." She shook her head. "Harry, we're not dealing with a simple case of injustice. We're looking at a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of magical government." Harry thought about Dumbledore's frequent speeches about the importance of unity, about how they must all stand together against the forces of darkness. He thought about the headmaster's talk of difficult choices and the greater good, about how sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the welfare of the wizarding world. "What if it's not a conspiracy at all?" he said slowly. "What if it's exactly what they intended? What if keeping Sirius in prison and Peter Pettigrew hidden serves some purpose that they think is more important than justice?" Hermione stared at him. "You're talking about a deliberate decision to sacrifice an innocent man for some supposed greater good." "Dumbledore's always talking about the greater good," Harry said, his voice bitter. "About how the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. What if he decided that keeping me with the Dursleys was more important than freeing Sirius? What if he thought that preserving some larger plan was worth letting an innocent man rot in the worst prison in the wizarding world?" The idea made him feel physically ill, but it explained everything they had discovered. The memory modifications hadn't been designed to cover up a crime. They'd been designed to ensure that no one would question a deliberate injustice. The denial of due process hadn't been an oversight. It had been a calculated decision to prevent Sirius from presenting evidence that might complicate their plans. "If you're right," Hermione said quietly, "then we're not just dealing with a cover-up. We're dealing with people who believe they have the right to decide who deserves justice and who doesn't, based on their own judgment of what serves the greater good. Harry looked around the library, thinking about all the students studying at the other tables, all the young people who trusted that the adults in charge of their world were fundamentally decent and fair. How many of them would continue to have that faith if they knew what Harry and Hermione had discovered? How many would still believe in the righteousness of their leaders if they understood the price that had been paid for their supposed security? "Tomorrow we talk to Ron," Harry said finally. "He needs to know what he's been living with, and we need to decide how far we're willing to go to expose the truth. Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. We'll be going up against some of the most powerful people in the wizarding world, and they've already proven that they're willing to sacrifice innocent people to protect their version of the greater good." Hermione gathered up their research with hands that trembled slightly. "I know," she said. "But Harry, how can we not? How can we let this continue, knowing what we know? Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 12 years for a crime he didn't commit. Peter Pettigrew has been free to report on your activities and potentially endanger everyone you care about. And the people we're supposed to trust, the people who are supposed to protect us," she shook her head. "They've built their power on lies and injustice." As they made their way back to Gryffindor Tower through the dark corridors, Harry found himself looking at Hogwarts with new eyes. The ancient castle had always felt like a refuge to him, a place where he was safe from the dangers of the outside world. But now he wondered how many other secrets were hidden within these walls, how many other injustices had been committed in the name of the greater good. Tomorrow, everything would change again. Tomorrow, Ron would learn that his beloved pet was actually one of the most wanted men in the wizarding world. And then, together, the three of them would have to decide whether they were brave enough to challenge a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of their world's power structure. But tonight, Harry allowed himself one last moment of innocence, one final night of believing that the truth, once revealed, would be enough to set things right. Tomorrow, he would discover just how naive that belief really was. Chapter 7. Ron's Crisis of Faith. Harry had faced Voldemort, battled a basilisk, and survived attacks by Dementors. But none of those experiences had prepared him for the task of telling his best friend that his beloved pet was actually a mass murderer. As he and Hermione sat in the empty common room Sunday morning, waiting for Ron to return from his shower, Harry felt his stomach churning with a mixture of dread and determination. "Remember," Hermione whispered, checking once more that they were alone. "We show him the evidence first. Let him draw his own conclusions before we tell him what we think it means." Harry nodded, though his mouth felt dry as parchment. They had spread their research across the low table, photographs, newspaper clippings, ministry documents, and Hermione's careful notes detailing every inconsistency they'd discovered. To Harry, the evidence seemed overwhelming, but he knew that Ron would be seeing it through the lens of years of affection for his pet. "What if he doesn't believe us?" Harry asked. "What if he thinks we're making it up, or that we've gone completely mad?" "Then we'll have to prove it to him," Hermione replied grimly. "But Harry, we can't move forward without him. If Scabbers really is Peter Pettigrew, then Ron is in danger every moment that rat is near him. And if we're going to confront Pettigrew directly," she shrugged helplessly, "we'll need Ron's help to catch him off guard." The portrait hole swung open, and Ron clattered through with his usual lack of grace, his hair still damp from his shower, and Scabbers perched contentedly on his shoulder. The rat looked perfectly ordinary in the morning sunlight, just a sleepy, aging pet enjoying the warmth of his master's body heat. "Morning," Ron said cheerfully, then paused when he noticed the serious expressions on his friends' faces. "Blimey, what's wrong? You both look like someone died." Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance. In a way, someone had died. Peter Pettigrew had supposedly died 12 years ago, and the Ron who loved his innocent pet rat was about to die too, replaced by someone who understood just how cruel and deceptive the world could be. "Ron," Hermione said carefully. "We need to talk to you about something. Something important." "About what?" Ron asked, settling into his favorite armchair. Scabbers immediately scurried down his arm and curled up in his lap, apparently preparing for a nap. "About your research project," Harry said, using the cover story they'd agreed on. "The one about the First Wizarding War. We've found some unusual information that might affect your family." That got Ron's attention. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual interest to concern. "What kind of information?" Hermione picked up one of the photographs they'd discovered, the image of the Potter family funeral, with the telltale gaps in the positioning. "This was taken at Harry's parents' funeral. Do you notice anything strange about it?" Ron studied the photograph for several minutes, his brow creasing in concentration. "It's hard to tell. Everyone looks so sad and... Wait." He pointed to the gap between Lupin and McGonagall. "It looks like someone should be standing there. Like the photographer was expecting one more person in the shot." "Exactly," Harry said. "Someone who was supposed to be there but wasn't. Or rather, someone who was there originally, but was later removed from the photograph." "Removed?" Ron looked confused. Why would anyone remove someone from a funeral photo? Instead of answering directly, Hermione handed him a newspaper clipping about Peter Pettigrew's heroic death. "What did you remember being told about this incident?" Ron read the article quickly, his expression growing more puzzled by the moment. "I remember Mum and Dad talking about it when I was little. Said it was terrible what happened to Peter Pettigrew. Called him a hero for trying to bring Sirius Black to justice." He looked up at them. "Why? What does this have to do with anything?" Harry took a deep breath. "Ron, what if Peter Pettigrew didn't actually die that day? What if he faked his death and went into hiding?" Ron stared at him blankly. "That's ridiculous. He was blown up. There was nothing left of him but a finger." "A finger," Hermione said, quietly. "That could easily have been cut off with a simple severing charm before the explosion. A finger that would provide convenient proof of death without requiring an actual body." "But why would he do that?" Ron demanded. "If he was trying to bring Black to justice, why would he fake his own death?" Harry felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment of truth. What if he wasn't trying to bring Black to justice? What if he was the real traitor? The colour drained from Ron's face. "You're saying that Sirius Black is innocent?" "We're saying the evidence suggests it's possible," Hermione said carefully. "And if Pettigrew did fake his death, he would have needed somewhere to hide. Somewhere safe, where no one would think to look for him." Ron was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Then his eyes widened with sudden understanding. "You think he's still alive? You think he's hiding somewhere, disguised, or—" He broke off, his gaze dropping to Scabbers, who was still sleeping peacefully in his lap. "No," Ron said flatly. "No, absolutely not. I know what you're thinking, and you're completely mental." "Ron," Harry began, but his friend cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Scabbers has been in my family for 8 years, Ron said, his voice rising. 8 years? He's just a rat, a perfectly normal, boring rat who sleeps most of the day and eats kitchen scraps. He's not some criminal mastermind in disguise." But even as he spoke, Ron's eyes kept darting down to Scabbers with a new wariness, as if he were seeing his pet for the first time. "Look at the timeline," Hermione said gently, pulling out her notes. "Scabbers joined your family in 1985 or 1986, several years after Pettigrew's supposed death. He was already old when Percy got him, which means he should have died years ago from natural causes. And Ron, when we interviewed Percy about his memories of the war, he said your parents initially doubted Pettigrew's heroism, but then suddenly changed their minds." "That doesn't mean anything," Ron said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And yesterday, when Crookshanks attacked Scabbers," Harry added, "did you notice how Scabbers reacted?" Not like a frightened animal, but like someone who understood exactly what was happening. Ron looked down at his pet again, and this time Scabbers opened one black eye and stared back at him. For just a moment, there was something disturbingly human in that gaze, something calculating and aware that no normal rat should possess. "No," Ron repeated, but the word came out as barely a whisper. Hermione reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. "Ron, there's a potion that can temporarily prevent magical transformations. If Scabbers is just a normal rat, it won't affect him at all. But if he's an animagus—" "You want to drug my pet based on some insane theory?" Ron's voice was getting louder, drawing attention from the few other students scattered around the common room. "We want to prove he's safe," Harry said firmly. "Ron, if there's even a chance that we're right, then you've been in danger every night for years. This thing has been sleeping in your bed, listening to your conversations, watching everything you do." Something in Harry's tone seemed to get through to Ron. He looked down at Scabbers again, and this time Harry saw the first crack in his certainty. "He does seem to understand things sometimes," Ron admitted reluctantly. "Things that a normal rat shouldn't comprehend. And he's been acting stranger lately, especially around you two." "Let us test him," Hermione pleaded. "Just a few drops of potion. If nothing happens, we'll apologize for being paranoid idiots and never mention this again." "But Ron, if we're right, and we do nothing—" Ron was quiet for several minutes, staring at his pet with an expression of growing unease. Finally, he looked up at his friends with eyes that seemed older than they had just moments before. "If you're wrong about this," he said slowly, "I'll never forgive either of you." "We understand," Harry said. Ron held out his hand for the vial. "How much?" "Just 3 drops in his water," Hermione said. "The potion is harmless to normal animals, but it will prevent any magical transformation for about an hour." Ron prepared a small dish of water and carefully measured out the potion drops, his hands shaking slightly. Scabbers, apparently sensing that something was different, had become more alert, his whiskers twitching as he watched Ron's movements with obvious wariness. "Come on, Scabbers," Ron said softly, setting the dish down near his pet. "Just have a drink." But Scabbers wouldn't go near the water. Instead, he began backing away from the dish, his small body trembling with what looked like pure terror. This wasn't the natural caution of an animal encountering something new. This was the specific fear of someone who knew exactly what they were being offered and understood the consequences of drinking it. "He knows," Harry said quietly. "Look at him, Ron. He knows what that potion does." Ron stared at his pet in growing horror. "Scabbers," he whispered, "it's just water. You love water." But the rat continued to back away, making small, distressed sounds that were unlike any normal rat noises Ron had ever heard. They sounded almost like whimpering, almost human. "We need to immobilize him," Hermione said, pulling out her wand. "He's going to try to run, and we can't let him escape." "Wait," Ron said sharply. "Let me try something first." He leaned closer to his pet, studying Scabbers with new eyes. "You can understand me, can't you? You always could." Scabbers went completely still, his black eyes fixed on Ron's face with unmistakable intelligence. "My God," Ron breathed. "How long? How long have you been pretending?" Before Scabbers could react, Ron reached out and gently but firmly grasped the rat's front paw, the one that had always seemed slightly malformed. Harry and Hermione leaned closer as Ron carefully extended the tiny digits, revealing what they had all suspected, but hoped they wouldn't find. Scabbers was missing the tip of one finger. "The finger they found after the explosion," Harry said, his voice barely audible. "You cut it off yourself." Ron released the paw and sat back in his chair, his face pale with shock and revulsion. "You've been living in my house," he said to the trembling rat, "sleeping in my bed, listening to my family's conversations. For 8 years." Scabbers, Peter Pettigrew, made a sound that was distinctly like a sob. You killed Harry's parents, Ron continued, his voice growing stronger with anger. You betrayed them to you-know-who, and then you let Sirius Black take the blame. You let him rot in Azkaban while you lived safely with my family. The rat was shaking so violently now that Harry was afraid he might have a heart attack before they could get any answers from him. And all this time, Ron's voice was rising again, all this time you've been watching us, watching Harry, probably reporting back to your Death Eater friends about everything we do, everywhere we go. Ron, Hermione said softly, we need to get him to transform back. We need his confession, his testimony about what really happened. But Ron wasn't finished. Years of affection were turning into years of rage as the full implications of the deception sank in. You made me care about you, he said, his voice cracking. You made me worry when you were sick, made me defend you when Hermione's cat tried to catch you. And all the time you were one of them. You were a Death Eater living in my house, and I never knew. Harry reached out and put a hand on Ron's shoulder. It's not your fault. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? Ron's eyes were bright with unshed tears. All the signs were there. The intelligence, the longevity, the way he reacted to certain conversations. I loved him. I thought he was my pet. And I loved him. And that made me blind to what he really was. Scabbers whimpered again, and this time there was no mistaking the sound for anything other than human distress. We're going to force you to change back, Ron told his former pet, and his voice was steady now, filled with a cold determination that Harry had never heard before. We're going to make you confess to what you did, and then we're going to make sure that everyone knows the truth about Sirius Black and about you. Harry felt a surge of fierce pride in his friend. Ron had just learned that everything he thought he knew about his beloved pet was a lie, that he'd been caring for the man who had murdered Harry's parents and betrayed one of their closest friends. But instead of falling apart, instead of retreating into denial, Ron was channeling his pain into determination to right the wrong that had been done. Together, Hermione said quietly, raising her wand alongside Ron's. We do this together. Together, Harry agreed, adding his wand to theirs. For the first time since his discovery on the Marauder's map, Harry felt truly hopeful. They were no longer just three confused teenagers trying to unravel a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of government. They were three friends, united by a shared commitment to justice, determined to expose the truth no matter how dangerous or difficult it might be. Tomorrow, they would force Peter Pettigrew to reveal himself and confess his crimes. Tonight, they would plan exactly how to ensure that his confession couldn't be denied, dismissed, or covered up by the same people who had orchestrated his disappearance in the first place. But right now, all that mattered was that they were together, and that Ron, despite his pain and anger, was with them completely. The trio was whole again, bound together not just by friendship, but by their shared disillusionment with the adults they had trusted, and their determination to fight for justice, even when the world seemed arrayed against them. Scabbers continued to tremble in Ron's lap, perhaps sensing that his 12 years of hiding were finally coming to an end. Chapter 8. The Animagus Revelation. The abandoned classroom on the 4th floor had been gathering dust for so long that even the ghosts avoided it. Cobwebs draped the empty desks like funeral shrouds, and the only light came from a few flickering candles Hermione had conjured with trembling hands. It was the perfect place for a confrontation that would either expose the truth or destroy them all. Harry stood near the door, his wand trained on the cage where Scabbers huddled in apparent terror. The rat had fought desperately when they'd captured him, biting and clawing with a ferocity that was definitely not normal rodent behavior. Even now, pressed against the back of the cage, his black eyes held an intelligence that made Harry's skin crawl. "Are you sure about this?" Ron asked for the 3rd time, though his voice held determination rather than doubt. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "There was no going back the moment we discovered the truth," Hermione replied, consulting the advanced Defense Against the Dark Arts text she'd borrowed from the restricted section. The Animagus Revelation charm should force him to resume his human form. But Harry, you'll need to maintain constant pressure with your magic. If he's been in rat form for years, his body will resist the transformation. Harry nodded, his jaw set with grim purpose. He had spent hours in the library that morning, studying every spell that might force an unwilling animagus to reveal their true form. The magic was dangerous, designed to strip away deceptions and illusions regardless of the subject's consent. But it was their only chance of getting undeniable proof. "Scabbers," Harry said quietly, addressing the rat directly. "We know who you are. We know what you've done. You can transform willingly and explain yourself, or we can force the change and drag the confession out of you. Either way, the truth is coming out today." The rat made a sound that was unmistakably a whimper of despair. Harry raised his wand, channeling every ounce of his anger and determination into the spell he'd memorized. "Revelio veritatis animagus." The effect was immediate and horrifying. Scabbers began convulsing in the cage, his small body stretching and expanding as if being pulled apart by invisible forces. His squeaks of pain became deeper, more human, as his limbs elongated and his grey fur began to recede. The transformation was violent and unnatural, nothing like the smooth changes Harry had seen Animagi perform voluntarily. Within moments, where a rat had been cowering, a man now crouched. Peter Pettigrew was smaller than Harry had expected, short, balding, with watery blue eyes and a weak chin that trembled with fear. His robes were shabby and ill-fitting, as if he'd grabbed them hastily from some forgotten trunk. Most notably, his right hand was missing its index finger, the old wound healed but unmistakably deliberate. "Please," Pettigrew wheezed, his voice high and reedy with panic. "Please, you don't understand. I can explain everything." "Then start explaining!" Ron snarled, his wand pointed directly at the man who had lived as his pet for 8 years. "Start with why you've been hiding in my house, spying on my family." Pettigrew's eyes darted between the 3 teenagers, clearly calculating his chances of escape or persuasion. When he spoke, his voice carried the wheedling tone of someone accustomed to talking his way out of trouble. "I had no choice," he said, wringing his hands. "You have to believe me. Voldemort would have killed me if I hadn't." "Don't!" Harry cut him off, his voice deadly quiet. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did. You betrayed my parents to Voldemort. You sold them out to save your own miserable life." Pettigrew flinched at Harry's tone, but desperation made him bold. Yes, I betrayed them, but I had no choice. Voldemort was winning, don't you see? The Order was falling apart. People were dying every week, and he could read minds, could torture information out of anyone he chose. James and Lily were going to die anyway. At least this way, I could survive to... "To what?" Hermione interrupted, her voice shaking with rage. "To let Sirius Black rot in Azkaban for your crimes? To spend 12 years living as a pet while an innocent man went insane in prison?" "Sirius was always stronger than me," Pettigrew said, a note of bitter resentment creeping into his voice. "He could have survived Azkaban better than I could survive Voldemort's interrogation. At least in prison, he was safe from..." Ron's hex hit him before he could finish the sentence. A stinging jinx that left Pettigrew gasping and clutching his chest. "Safe?" Ron roared. "You think Azkaban is safe? You think 12 years with Dementors is preferable to whatever you were afraid of?" "You don't understand what it was like," Pettigrew whined, tears now streaming down his face. "You weren't there during the war. You didn't see what Voldemort did to people who disappointed him. The Longbottoms were better connected than I was, and look what happened to them." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. What about the Longbottoms? But Pettigrew had apparently said more than he'd intended. He clamped his mouth shut, shaking his head frantically. "What about my placement with the Dursleys?" Harry pressed, stepping closer to the cage. "What does Dumbledore know about that?" Pettigrew's eyes went wide with fresh terror, and Harry knew they'd struck on something important. He knows everything," Pettigrew whispered. "He's known I was alive from the beginning, has known where I was, what form I was taking, everything." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Even though he'd suspected as much, hearing it confirmed by Pettigrew himself made his knees weak with rage and betrayal. "Why?" Harry demanded. "Why would Dumbledore allow an innocent man to remain in prison? Why would he let you spy on me for years?" Pettigrew looked around the room desperately, as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because he needed Sirius in Azkaban. He needed you with your relatives, the blood protection, the connection to your mother. It only works if you're with her family. If Sirius had been free, he would have claimed custody immediately. He had the legal right, and more than that, he had the determination to fight anyone who tried to keep you from him." "So Dumbledore chose to let me be abused," Harry said, his voice eerily calm, rather than risk losing control over where I lived. "It wasn't supposed to be abuse," Pettigrew said quickly. "The headmaster thought your relatives would at least care for your basic needs, would keep you safe and fed until you came to Hogwarts. The reports I sent back. I only told him what I observed during summer holidays, and you always seemed healthy enough when you returned to school." Harry's vision went red around the edges. "You reported on me. You told Dumbledore what the Dursleys were doing to me, and he chose to leave me there anyway." "The greater good," Pettigrew mumbled, not meeting Harry's eyes. "That's what he always said. Your suffering was unfortunate, but it served the greater purpose of keeping you alive and preparing you for what was to come." "Preparing me for what?" Harry whispered, though he was beginning to understand with horrible clarity. Pettigrew finally looked up, and his expression was almost pitying. "For the war, Harry. For the final battle with Voldemort. Dumbledore needed you hungry for family, desperate for connection, willing to sacrifice yourself for the people you care about. Happy children don't make good martyrs." The silence that followed was deafening. Harry could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing in his ears as the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation became clear. Every lonely night at Privet Drive, every moment of neglect and cruelty, every time he'd wondered why no one came to rescue him, it had all been deliberate, calculated, designed to shape him into the perfect weapon against Voldemort. "You're lying," Hermione said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Pettigrew challenged, seeming to gain confidence from their shock. "Think about it. Why else would the great Albus Dumbledore leave the boy who lived with muggles who hated magic? Why would he ignore obvious signs of neglect year after year? Why would he allow an innocent man to waste away in Azkaban when he had the power to free him at any time?" "Because he's a manipulative bastard who thinks he knows what's best for everyone," Ron said flatly, and Harry was startled by the venom in his friend's voice. Pettigrew nodded eagerly. "Exactly. The greater good, he calls it. The needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. He's been playing chess with people's lives for decades, and we're all just pieces on his board." Harry stared at the pathetic man in the cage, feeling a mixture of rage and disgust that threatened to overwhelm him. "What else?" he demanded. "What else has Dumbledore been hiding?" "Everything," Pettigrew said bitterly. "The prophecy about you and Voldemort. The real reason your parents went into hiding. The identity of the Death Eaters who were never caught. The location of Horcruxes that—" He cut himself off abruptly, his face going white with terror as he realized what he'd almost revealed. "Horcruxes?" Hermione asked sharply. "What are Horcruxes?" But Pettigrew was shaking his head frantically. "I can't! I won't! That's beyond what I can tell you. Some secrets are too dangerous, even for this." Harry raised his wand again, magic crackling around him with barely controlled fury. You're going to tell us everything, Pettigrew. Every lie, every secret, every detail of this conspiracy that's destroyed so many lives." "I can't," Pettigrew screamed, and for the first time his terror seemed genuine rather than calculated. "You don't understand what you're asking. There are things in motion that are bigger than all of us. Secrets that could destroy the entire wizarding world if they came out at the wrong time." "Maybe the wizarding world deserves to be destroyed," Harry said quietly, and something in his tone made Pettigrew go very still. "Maybe a world built on lies and manipulation and the sacrifice of innocent people isn't worth preserving." Before Pettigrew could respond, he suddenly lunged toward the side of the cage, his hands closing around a piece of broken wood that must have been left behind by some long-ago student. For a moment, Harry thought he was going to try to use it as a weapon, but instead, Pettigrew pressed the sharp edge to his own throat. "Stay back," he gasped. "Stay back, or I'll do it. I'll kill myself right here, and all your evidence dies with me." "Don't be an idiot," Ron snapped. "We're not going to hurt you. We just want the truth." "The truth will get me killed anyway," Pettigrew replied, his voice high with hysteria. "Do you think Voldemort will forgive me for revealing his secrets? Do you think Dumbledore will protect me if I expose his manipulations? I'm dead either way, so why should I help you?" Harry stepped forward slowly, his wand still raised but his voice gentle. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because Sirius Black has been suffering for 12 years for crimes he didn't commit. Because I deserved to know the truth about my parents, about my placement with the Dursleys, about the plans being made for my life. And because," Hermione added quietly, "this is your chance to finally do something decent, to make up for even a small part of the damage you've caused." Pettigrew stared at them for a long moment, the improvised weapon trembling in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was broken. "You really think it matters? You really think exposing all of this will make any difference in the end?" "It matters to Sirius," Harry said firmly. "It matters to me. And it should matter to you if there's anything left of the person who was once James Potter's friend." Something in Pettigrew's expression crumbled at the mention of James, and the wood dropped from his nerveless fingers. "James," he whispered. "He tried to save me, you know. Even at the end, when Voldemort came for them, James was shouting for Lily to take you and run. He was still trying to protect everyone, even the friend who had just betrayed him." Tears were streaming down Pettigrew's face now, and for the first time since his transformation, he looked genuinely human rather than simply pathetic. "I'll confess," he said quietly. "I'll tell you everything I know about Dumbledore's plans, about the conspiracy to keep Sirius imprisoned, about the manipulation of your life. But Harry, when this comes out, when the truth is finally revealed, it's going to destroy everything you thought you knew about the wizarding world. Are you prepared for that?" Harry looked at his friends. Ron, whose faith in authority had been shattered by the discovery of what his pet really was, and Hermione, whose analytical mind had led her to conclusions that challenged everything she'd once believed about justice and fairness. "We're prepared," he said. "We've been preparing for weeks, ever since I first saw your name on the Marauder's map. The wizarding world built itself on lies. Maybe it's time for the truth, no matter how much it hurts." Pettigrew nodded slowly, and when he began to speak again, his voice carried the weight of 12 years of hidden guilt and fear. But they had spent an hour after Pettigrew's confession planning this confrontation, reviewing every piece of evidence they'd gathered, and preparing for the arguments Dumbledore would likely make. But now, climbing toward the office of the most powerful wizard in Britain, Harry felt the weight of what they were about to do. They weren't just challenging a teacher or even a headmaster. They were confronting the leader of the light, the man the entire wizarding world trusted to protect them from darkness. The door to the office stood slightly ajar, as if Dumbledore had been expecting them. Harry pushed it open and stepped inside, his friends close behind him. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his desk, his long fingers steepled before him, and his blue eyes twinkling with what looked like genuine warmth. The Phoenix Fawkes perched on his stand nearby, preening his golden feathers with apparent unconcern. The portraits of former headmasters dozed in their frames, though Harry noticed that several seemed to be watching through barely opened eyes. "Harry, my dear boy," Dumbledore said pleasantly, rising from his chair, "and Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley, how delightful to see you all together. Though I confess, I am somewhat curious about your companion." His gaze shifted to the bound figure floating behind them, and for just a moment his genial expression flickered. When it returned, it was perhaps a shade too bright, too practiced. "I see you have discovered our friend Peter," Dumbledore continued, settling back into his chair. "I imagine you have questions." "Questions?" Harry's voice came out sharper than he'd intended. "Professor, this man has been hiding as Ron's pet for 8 years, while Sirius Black rots in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit. I think we're a bit past questions." Dumbledore nodded slowly, as if Harry had made a reasonable observation about the weather. "Yes, I can understand how that must appear to you. The situation is complex." "Complex?" Ron stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This piece of filth has been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, listening to my family's private conversations. He betrayed Harry's parents and let my family care for him like he was some innocent pet. How is that complex?" "Mr. Weasley," Dumbledore said gently, "I understand your distress. Truly I do. But there are factors at play here that you cannot possibly comprehend. Sometimes, in war, we must make choices that seem cruel, but serve a greater purpose." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You knew. You've known all along that he was alive, that he was with the Weasleys." It wasn't a question, but Dumbledore answered anyway. "Yes, Harry, I have known." The simple admission hit the room like a physical force. Even though they had expected it, hearing Dumbledore confirm their worst suspicions made the betrayal feel fresh and raw. "Why?" Hermione asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you leave Sirius in prison when you knew he was innocent?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying each of them in turn. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of difficult decisions, because Sirius Black's freedom would have complicated a great many things, Miss Granger. Most particularly, it would have complicated Harry's placement with his relatives. Harry's hands clenched into fists. "My placement with the Dursleys. You mean my abuse? Your protection," Dumbledore corrected gently. "The blood magic that shields you from Voldemort's reach is powerful beyond measure, Harry, but it requires you to call your mother's family home. If Sirius had been free, he would have fought to claim custody of you. He is your godfather, after all, and his legal rights would have been difficult to challenge. So you chose to let an innocent man suffer in the worst prison in the wizarding world, rather than risk losing control over where I lived," Harry said flatly. "I chose to prioritize your survival over Sirius's comfort," Dumbledore replied, and there was steel beneath the gentle tone. "Azkaban is terrible, yes, but it is not fatal. Voldemort's personal attention, however, would have been." Harry stared at the man who had been his mentor, his guide, his protector, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. "Comfort? You think 12 years with Dementors is a matter of comfort?" "No," Dumbledore said quietly. "I think it is a tragedy. But Harry, you must understand. The prophecy that governs your fate and Voldemort's makes clear that in the end, one of you must kill the other. Everything I have done, every decision I have made, has been in service of ensuring that when that moment comes, you will be prepared to do what must be done." The prophecy. Harry had heard whispers of it, hints and fragments, but never the whole truth. What prophecy? Dumbledore hesitated, perhaps recognizing that he was about to cross a line he had planned to avoid for years yet. The prophecy made by Sybil Trelawney before your birth. It states that neither you nor Voldemort can live while the other survives, that you have a power he knows not, and that you will be the one to vanquish him. And you've been preparing me for this my entire life, Harry said slowly, understanding flooding through him like poison. The Dursleys, the isolation, the way you've kept me in the dark about so many things. You've been molding me into your perfect weapon. I have been ensuring your survival, Dumbledore said firmly. And yes, preparing you for the burden that fate has placed upon your shoulders. Harry, you were raised by people who could not love you, because I needed you to be hungry for connection, desperate for the family and acceptance that you found at Hogwarts. Children who are loved unconditionally often lack the motivation to sacrifice themselves for others. But I would die for my friends, Harry finished, his voice hollow with realization. Because I've never had anything else. Because you made sure I never had anything else. Dumbledore's expression was pained, but resolute. Because the wizarding world needs you to be willing to make that sacrifice when the time comes. Harry, I take no pleasure in the choices I have made. But if your suffering, yours and Sirius's, can save thousands of innocent lives, then it is a price I am willing to pay. A price you're willing to pay, Ron repeated, his voice shaking with fury. Not a price you're paying yourself, but a price you're making other people pay while you sit safely in your tower, making calculations. Mr. Weasley, Dumbledore began, but Harry cut him off. No. The word came out with such force that several of the portraits stirred in their frames. No more manipulation. No more justifications. No more treating people like chess pieces in your war against Voldemort. Dumbledore leaned forward, his eyes intense. Harry, you must understand. I understand perfectly, Harry interrupted. You decided that defeating Voldemort was more important than justice, more important than Sirius's freedom, more important than my right to a family that actually cared about me. You made those decisions without consulting any of the people affected by them, and you've spent years lying to cover up what you've done. Sometimes leaders must make choices that others cannot understand, Dumbledore said quietly. The greater good, Harry spat. How many times have you used those words to justify destroying people's lives? How many other Sirius Blacks are rotting in prison because freeing them would be inconvenient for your plans? How many other children are being abused because it serves your strategy? Dumbledore's facade of gentle concern finally cracked, revealing something harder beneath. You think this has been easy for me, Harry? You think I have not agonized over every choice, every sacrifice? I have carried the weight of these decisions for 13 years, knowing that history will judge me harshly for the methods I have used. But I have also seen what Voldemort is capable of when unopposed. I have watched him murder entire families for sport, torture children for information their parents might possess, destroy everything good and decent in this world simply because he can. So you became like him, Hermione said quietly, and her words cut through the room like a blade. You decided that other people's lives were yours to spend, that their pain was acceptable if it served your purposes. How are you any different from Voldemort, Professor? How are you any different from the Death Eaters who torture people for information? Dumbledore went very still, his blue eyes flashing with something that might have been anger. Miss Granger, I would ask you to consider your words carefully. I have considered them, Hermione replied steadily, and I stand by them. You've spent years manipulating Harry's life, orchestrating his abuse, and allowing innocent people to suffer in prison, all without their consent, all based on your judgment of what serves the greater good. That's exactly what Voldemort does, Professor. The only difference is that he admits he's willing to sacrifice anyone for his goals. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the portrait seemed to have stopped breathing, and Fawkes had gone perfectly still on his perch. You are children, Dumbledore said finally, and his voice was colder than Harry had ever heard it. "You have no conception of the scope of this war, no understanding of what is at stake. Yes, I have made difficult choices. Yes, I have allowed individuals to suffer for the sake of the greater cause. But I have done so to prevent the enslavement or destruction of the entire wizarding world." "And who gave you the right to make those choices?" Harry demanded. "Who elected you to decide whose suffering is acceptable and whose lives are worth sacrificing? You talk about preventing enslavement, but you've enslaved me to your plans from the moment I was born." Dumbledore stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "I have given my entire life to protecting this world from darkness, Harry Potter. Every choice I have made, every sacrifice I have demanded, has been in service of that goal. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, so be it. But I will not apologize for doing what was necessary to ensure Voldemort's defeat." "Then we're done here," Harry said, turning toward where Pettigrew floated in his magical bindings. "Professor, you have until tomorrow morning to arrange for Sirius Black's immediate release from Azkaban and full exoneration for the crimes he didn't commit. Peter Pettigrew will be surrendering himself to the authorities and providing a full confession of his actual role in my parents' deaths." "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "you do not understand the forces you are setting in motion. Voldemort's return is inevitable, and when it comes, you will need every advantage I can provide. Do not throw away your protection out of anger." Harry turned back to face the man who had controlled his life for 13 years, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "I'd rather face Voldemort with the truth than live under your protection, built on lies. You want to talk about the greater good, Professor? Here's my version. Sirius Black deserves justice. I deserve the right to make my own choices about my life. And the wizarding world deserves to know that the man they've trusted to protect them thinks their lives are expendable if it serves his purposes." "And if Voldemort kills you because you refused my guidance?" Dumbledore asked quietly. "If your death means the enslavement of everyone you claim to be protecting?" "Then at least I'll die as myself," Harry replied. "Not as the weapon you tried to forge me into." He turned toward the door, his friends falling into step beside him. Behind them, Peter Pettigrew whimpered softly as he was dragged along in his magical bonds. "Tomorrow morning, Professor," Harry said without looking back. "Free Sirius, or we'll make sure the entire wizarding world knows exactly what kind of man they've been trusting with their safety." The door closed behind them with a soft click, but Harry could feel Dumbledore's eyes on his back all the way down the spiraling staircase. As they emerged into the corridor beyond the gargoyle, Ron let out a shaky breath. "Well," he said, attempting his usual humor despite the tremor in his voice, "I don't think we'll be getting any more Christmas presents from the headmaster." "We did it," Hermione said, and she sounded almost surprised. "We actually stood up to Albus Dumbledore and told him we wouldn't accept his manipulations anymore." Harry nodded, feeling strangely light despite the magnitude of what they had just done. For the first time in his life, he had rejected the authority of the adults who claimed to know what was best for him. He had chosen his own path, his own moral compass, over the guidance of the most powerful wizard in the world. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and absolutely necessary. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Sirius Black would be free, and the wizarding world would learn that their beloved leader was capable of sacrificing innocent people for what he deemed the greater good. But tonight, Harry Potter was finally free to choose his own destiny. Chapter 10. The Price of Truth. Harry had expected Dumbledore to fight them. He had prepared himself for more manipulation, more philosophical arguments about the greater good, perhaps even magical compulsion to prevent them from exposing the truth. What he hadn't expected was the quiet resignation in the headmaster's eyes when they returned to his office the next morning, or the way Dumbledore's shoulders seemed to have aged decades overnight. "I have contacted Minister Fudge," Dumbledore said, without preamble as they entered. His voice was steady but hollow, like an echo of his former warmth. "He will be arriving within the hour, along with a team of Aurors and Ministry officials. Peter Pettigrew will be taken into custody, and the process of exonerating Sirius Black will begin immediately." Harry felt a surge of triumph mixed with something that might have been pity. In the grey morning light streaming through the office windows, Dumbledore looked every one of his 112 years, an old man who had made terrible choices and was finally being forced to face their consequences. "What about the memory modifications?" Hermione asked, pulling out the notes they'd compiled over the past weeks. "The witnesses whose recollections were altered, the evidence that was suppressed?" "All of it will come to light," Dumbledore replied. "I suspect Minister Fudge will be most eager to distance himself and the Ministry from any appearance of impropriety." Ron snorted. Bit late for that, considering he was there from the beginning. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Weasley, I suspect you'll find that many people who claimed to be acting in good faith were more aware of the truth than they admitted. The Ministry will need scapegoats, and I imagine I will serve admirably in that role." Before anyone could respond, the fireplace flared green, and Cornelius Fudge stumbled through in a cloud of soot and panic. The Minister for Magic looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his usually pristine robes wrinkled, and his bowler hat sitting askew on his head. Behind him came a small army of officials, Aurors with hands resting on their wands, Ministry lawyers clutching briefcases, and several people Harry didn't recognize, but who radiated the kind of authority that suggested very high rank indeed. "Dumbledore!" Fudge gasped, straightening his hat with shaking hands. "Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Please tell me that Peter Pettigrew is not actually sitting in your office, alive and confessing to crimes we've spent 12 years prosecuting Sirius Black for." Dumbledore gestured toward the chair where Pettigrew sat bound, looking even more pathetic in the cold light of day. "I'm afraid not, Cornelius. Mr. Pettigrew is indeed very much alive, and has provided a full confession to his role in the Potter family murders." Fudge stared at the bound man for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and what looked like genuine terror. "Do you have any idea," he said in a strangled whisper, "what this is going to do to the Ministry, to public confidence in our justice system, to my career?" "I imagine it will be quite damaging on all counts," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Damaging!" Fudge's voice rose to a near shriek. "Damaging! We sent an innocent man to Azkaban without a trial. We allowed the real traitor to live free while Sirius Black was driven mad by Dementors. And you—" He whirled to face Dumbledore, his face flushed with rage and fear. "You knew. You've known all along, and you said nothing." "I made choices based on information you were not privy to," Dumbledore said. "Choices that served what I believed to be the greater good of the wizarding world." The greater good? One of the Aurors, Harry recognized him as Kingsley Shacklebolt, stepped forward, his dark face grim with disgust. "Professor, with all due respect, the greater good doesn't include deliberately perverting the course of justice." Harry watched the exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had wanted the truth to come out, had demanded that Sirius be freed, and the conspiracy exposed. But now, seeing the panic in Fudge's eyes, and the way the Ministry officials were looking at each other with dawning horror, he began to understand the true scope of what they had set in motion. "Where is Sirius Black now?" asked a witch. Harry didn't recognize, though her official robe suggested she held high rank in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. "He has been contacted and is en route," Dumbledore replied. "I expect him to arrive momentarily." As if summoned by his words, a great black dog bounded through the office window, which had apparently been left open despite the January cold. The dog landed heavily on the stone floor, panting and wild-eyed, before beginning the transformation back to human form. Harry had seen photographs of Sirius Black from before his imprisonment, a handsome young man with aristocratic features and a devil-may-care grin that spoke of confidence and joy in life. The man who now stood before them bore little resemblance to those images. 12 years in Azkaban had left Sirius gaunt and hollow-eyed, his black hair streaked with premature grey, and his face marked with lines of suffering that made him look far older than his 33 years. But when those grey eyes found Harry across the room, they filled with an emotion so powerful it made Harry's chest tight with answering feeling. "Harry," Sirius whispered, and his voice was rough with disuse and barely contained tears. "My God, look at you. You look so much like James." Harry had imagined this moment countless times since learning of Sirius's innocence, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. This broken, traumatized man was his godfather, the person who should have raised him, who should have been there for scraped knees and nightmares and first days of school, the person who had been stolen from both of them by lies and manipulation, and the supposed greater good. "Sirius," Harry managed, his own voice thick with emotion. He started toward his godfather, but Sirius held up a trembling hand. "Wait," Sirius said, his eyes never leaving Harry's face. I need to understand what's happened. How you discovered the truth. How long you've known that I was innocent." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. The anguish of a man who had spent over a decade believing that the godson he loved thought him a murderer and traitor. "Only a few weeks," Harry said quickly. "We only figured it out a few weeks ago, I swear. Before that, I believed. Everyone told me you had betrayed my parents, and I didn't know any better." Sirius closed his eyes, and a tear traced its way down his hollow cheek. "A few weeks. You've only known the truth for a few weeks, and you've already forced the Ministry to act." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Dumbledore. "How long have you known, Albus?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Ministry officials seemed to hold their breath as they waited for Dumbledore's answer. "Since the beginning," Dumbledore said quietly. "I have known of your innocence since November 1st. 1981. If Harry had been expecting an explosion of rage from Sirius, he would have been disappointed. Instead, his godfather went very still, his face cycling through expressions too complex and rapid to follow. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. 12 years, Sirius said. 12 years, Albus. 12 years of dementors and darkness and madness, while you sat in this office making decisions about the greater good. Sirius, Dumbledore began, but Sirius cut him off with a gesture. No, don't explain. Don't justify. Don't tell me about the prophecy, or Harry's protection, or any of the other calculations you've made with our lives. Sirius's voice was getting stronger, more steady, as if his anger was burning away 12 years of despair. Just tell me this. Was it worth it? Was my suffering, Harry's abuse, James and Lily's son growing up unloved and unwanted? Was it all worth whatever grand strategy you were pursuing? Dumbledore met Sirius's gaze steadily. I believe it will be when Voldemort returns and Harry is prepared to face him. The honest answer seemed to hit Sirius like a physical blow. You bastard, he whispered. You absolute bastard. You sacrificed everything we cared about, everyone we loved, and you're not even sorry. I am profoundly sorry, Dumbledore replied, but I am not apologetic. The choices I made were necessary. Before Sirius could respond, Fudge cleared his throat nervously. Yes, well, fascinating as this is, fascinating. We have legal processes to follow. Mr. Pettigrew must be taken into custody immediately and given a proper trial. Sirius Black must be officially exonerated and his name cleared in the public record. And there will need to be a full investigation into how this miscarriage of justice was allowed to occur. The way he said it made clear that any such investigation would be focused on finding scapegoats rather than uncovering the truth. But Harry was beyond caring about ministry politics. Sirius was free, Peter Pettigrew would face justice. That was what mattered. "What about Harry's living arrangements?" Hermione asked, and Harry blessed her for thinking of practical matters when his own mind was reeling with emotion. If Sirius is officially exonerated, doesn't he have legal rights as Harry's godfather? Fudge looked panicked again. That's a complicated matter. The existing arrangements with Mr. Potter's relatives were made through proper channels, and changing them would require— "I want to live with Sirius," Harry said firmly, cutting through whatever bureaucratic nonsense Fudge was about to spout. "I want to live with my godfather." Sirius looked at him with an expression of hope and terror. "Harry, I'm not the man I was before Azkaban. I have nightmares, flashbacks. Sometimes I can barely function. Are you sure you want to take that on? Are you sure you want to take on a teenager who spent his whole life being lied to and manipulated?" Harry countered. "Who has nightmares about Voldemort and a tendency to attract life-threatening situations?" For the first time since his transformation, Sirius smiled. Not the wild grin of his youth, but something smaller and more fragile, touched with wonder. "When you put it like that," he said, "it sounds like we might be perfect for each other." The legal proceedings that followed were a blur of paperwork, formal statements, and bureaucratic maneuvering. Peter Pettigrew was taken into custody by the Aurors, whimpering and pleading for mercy that no one seemed inclined to provide. Ministry officials scrambled to minimize the political damage, already crafting statements that would present the whole affair as an unfortunate oversight rather than a systematic conspiracy. But through it all, Harry found himself watching Sirius, memorizing the reality of his godfather's presence after years of believing him to be a dangerous enemy. The man was clearly damaged by his ordeal. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and he startled at sudden noises. But there was a strength in him that had survived 12 years in hell, a core of love and loyalty that even Azkaban hadn't been able to destroy. As the ministry officials finally prepared to leave, taking Pettigrew with them and leaving behind a stack of forms that would need to be filed to make Sirius's exoneration official, Harry realized that the hardest part was yet to come. Sirius was free, but they were both broken people trying to figure out how to become a family. The wizarding world would have to grapple with the truth about its trusted leaders, and somewhere in the distance, Voldemort's return loomed like a gathering storm. But for the first time in his life, Harry would face those challenges with someone who loved him unconditionally, someone who had chosen him not out of duty or manipulation or the greater good, but out of simple, honest affection. "Ready to go home?" Sirius asked quietly as the last of the ministry officials disappeared through the fireplace. Harry looked around Dumbledore's office one final time, at the portraits that had watched generations of secrets unfold, at the instruments that gleamed with mysterious purpose, at the old man who had shaped so much of his life through careful lies and calculated truths. "Yeah," Harry said, turning back to his godfather. "I'm ready." They walked out of the office together, leaving behind the weight of secrets and the burden of other people's expectations. Whatever came next, they would face it as family, damaged, healing, but finally, truly free. Chapter 11. Rebuilding from Ashes. The ancient house at Grimmauld Place had been empty for over a decade, and it showed. Dust sheets covered furniture that had been elegant once, before years of neglect had left everything faded and worn. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and several of the portraits on the walls had been damaged by damp, their occupants either departed entirely or reduced to indistinct smudges of paint and magical residue. Harry stood in the entrance hall, his trunk at his feet, trying to reconcile this decaying mansion with his mental image of where his godfather had grown up. The Black family had been one of the most prestigious pure-blood dynasties in Britain, but their ancestral home felt more like a mausoleum than a palace. "It's not much to look at, I know," Sirius said quietly, following Harry's gaze around the deteriorating grandeur. "My mother was particular about bloodline purity and proper behavior. After I ran away to live with the Potters, she blasted my name off the family tree and pretended I'd never existed. The house has been sealed since she died, just sitting here gathering dust and bad memories." It had been 2 weeks since Sirius's official exoneration. 2 weeks of legal proceedings and media attention, and the slow, complicated process of undoing 12 years of injustice. The Daily Prophet had been full of competing narratives, some painting Sirius as a tragic hero, others focusing on the ministry's failures, still others questioning how such a miscarriage of justice could have occurred under Dumbledore's watch. Through it all, Harry had remained at Hogwarts, finishing his classes and trying to process everything that had happened. But when the February half-term break arrived, Sirius had quietly asked if Harry would like to spend it with him at the family home. Not because Harry had to, not because some adult authority figure had decided it was best, but because Sirius wanted to get to know his godson, and Harry had found himself wanting the same thing. "We can make it better," Harry said, looking around the hall with new eyes. "Clean it up, make it feel like home instead of a museum." Sirius smiled, and it was getting easier each day. The expressions of genuine warmth were slowly replacing the wild, desperate look that had haunted his face since Azkaban. "I'd like that. I always hated this place when I was growing up. But maybe we can make it into something different. Something better." They spent the first day simply exploring the house, room by room, as Sirius shared memories both bitter and fond. The library where he'd hidden from his mother's rages. The kitchen where Creature the house elf had served elaborate meals to a family that barely spoke to each other, except to argue about blood purity and proper behavior. The drawing room where portraits of deceased Black family members still hung, most of them glaring disapprovingly at their blood traitor descendant. But it was in Sirius's childhood bedroom, preserved exactly as he'd left it at 16, that they had their first real conversation about the past. "Your father used to sneak in through that window," Sirius said, gesturing toward the tall casement that overlooked the street. "Usually around midnight, usually with some mad scheme that would get us both in trouble. My parents never figured out how he managed it. The house had every protection charm known to wizard kind, but James was brilliant at finding ways around magical barriers." Harry sat on the narrow bed, running his fingers over the faded Gryffindor banner that still hung on the wall. What was he like? Really like, I mean, not the sanitized version everyone always tells me. Sirius was quiet for a moment, staring out the window as if he could still see his best friend climbing through it after all these years. He was intense, passionate about everything he cared about, whether it was Quidditch or defending someone who was being bullied or winning your mother's heart. He couldn't do anything halfway. When James Potter loved something, he threw his whole soul into it. And my mother, brilliant, fiery. She could make James tongue-tied just by looking at him, right up until 7th year when he finally convinced her he'd grown out of being an arrogant Taurog. Sirius's smile was soft with memory. She saw right through people's pretenses, could spot a lie from across the great hall. And she never, ever backed down from standing up for what she thought was right, even when it would have been safer to keep quiet. Harry absorbed this, trying to fit these real, complex people into the idealized images he'd carried for so long. "Do you think they would be proud of me? Of what I did with Pettigrew and Dumbledore?" Sirius turned from the window, his expression serious. "Harry, your parents died fighting against people who thought they had the right to decide who lived and who died, who was worthy of freedom and who deserved to suffer. What you did, refusing to let Dumbledore manipulate you, insisting on justice for everyone regardless of his grand plans, that's exactly what they would have done." The word settled something in Harry's chest, a knot of uncertainty he'd been carrying since the confrontation in Dumbledore's office. He had made the right choice, even when it meant defying the most powerful wizard in the world. That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner in a kitchen that hadn't been used for cooking in over a decade, Harry noticed the way Sirius's hands shook whenever he had to handle sharp objects, the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at nothing, his eyes dark with memories that had nothing to do with the present moment. "The nightmares are the worst part," Sirius said suddenly, apparently noticing Harry's observation. "Not just the dreams, but the way they bleed into waking hours. Sometimes I'll be doing something perfectly ordinary, like making tea, and suddenly I'm back in that cell, listening to the Dementors whisper about all the ways I'd failed everyone I ever cared about." Harry set down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir soup. "I have nightmares too, about Voldemort mostly, but sometimes about the Dursleys, about feeling trapped and helpless while everyone else decided what was going to happen to me." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, two damaged people trying to figure out how to heal together. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Sirius said with a rueful laugh. "A traumatized teenager and his mentally unstable godfather trying to play house in a decaying mansion." "Maybe that's exactly what we need," Harry replied. "No one expecting us to be perfect, no one pretending we should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection we're thrown. Just honesty about who we are and what we've been through." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an official-looking owl, carrying a letter bearing the Ministry seal. Sirius opened it with visible reluctance, his face growing grimmer as he read. "What is it?" Harry asked. "Update on the political fallout," Sirius said, setting the letter aside. 3 more Ministry officials have been forced to resign over their involvement in covering up the truth about Pettigrew. Fudge is trying to weather the storm, but there are calls for his removal as well. And Dumbledore." He paused, looking uncertain about whether to continue. "What about Dumbledore?" "He's been removed from his position on the Wizengamot. The International Confederation of Wizards is reviewing his membership. There's talk of an investigation into other decisions he's made over the years, other times when he might have prioritized his own judgment over proper legal procedures." Harry felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Satisfaction that there were consequences for Dumbledore's actions, but also a strange sadness at seeing someone he'd once revered brought so low. "Do you think I was wrong?" Harry asked. "Exposing everything like that? Maybe the wizarding world was better off not knowing how corrupt their institutions really were." Sirius reached across the table and grasped Harry's hand. "Harry, listen to me. You did not cause this corruption. You exposed it. You didn't create the injustice. You forced it into the light where it could finally be addressed. Yes, people are scared and angry now, but that's better than living in ignorance while innocent people suffer in prison." The warmth in Sirius's voice, the certainty of his support, was something Harry had never experienced before. Not from the Dursleys, who had seen him as a burden. Not from Dumbledore, whose affection had always come with conditions and expectations. This was unconditional love, offered freely without demanding anything in return. "Ron and Hermione stopped by Hogwarts yesterday," Harry said, changing the subject to something lighter. "They wanted to make sure I was settling in all right here. How are they handling everything?" Harry smiled, remembering his friend's fierce loyalty throughout the entire ordeal. "Better than I expected. Ron's still angry about Pettigrew living in his house for so long, but he says it's made him more careful about trusting people just because adults tell him he should. And Hermione, she's been reading everything she can find about wrongful convictions and institutional corruption. I think she's planning to become a lawyer or something, make sure this kind of thing can't happen again. Good friends, Sirius observed, the kind who stick with you even when standing by you, makes their own lives more complicated. The best friends, Harry agreed. They could have stayed out of it, could have let me handle the investigation alone. But they chose to help, even when it meant going up against Dumbledore and the Ministry. That night, as Harry lay in bed in a room that was slowly becoming his own, he listened to the sounds of Sirius moving around the house, checking locks, drawing curtains, performing the small rituals that helped him feel secure in a world that had betrayed him so completely. They were both learning how to trust again, how to care for someone else after years of having their faith shattered by the people who were supposed to protect them. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when Harry caught himself analyzing Sirius's words for hidden meanings, still times when Sirius retreated into himself rather than risk being vulnerable. But slowly, carefully, they were building something real, a relationship based on choice rather than obligation, truth rather than manipulation. From his bedroom window, Harry could see the lights of London stretching out in all directions, millions of people going about their lives with no idea that their world had recently been shaken to its foundations. The Ministry was struggling to rebuild public trust. Dumbledore's reputation was in tatters. The entire wizarding world was being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their leaders were capable of terrible mistakes. But here, in this old house, with its faded grandeur and complicated history, Harry Potter was finally learning what it meant to have a family. Not the family that circumstance had given him, not the family that authority figures had decided was best for him, but the family he had chosen for himself. Tomorrow, he would return to Hogwarts to finish his 3rd year. There would be whispers and stares, questions about what it was like to expose the conspiracy that had fooled the wizarding world for over a decade. There would be challenges ahead, Voldemort's eventual return, the ongoing political upheaval, the long process of healing from years of manipulation and abuse. But for the first time in his life, Harry would face those challenges with someone who loved him unconditionally by his side, someone who had chosen to build a life with him, not out of duty or strategy, but out of simple, honest affection. It was more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 12. Understanding Everything. The Great Hall looked exactly the same as it had when Harry had first walked into it 3.5 years ago. The same floating candles, the same enchanted ceiling reflecting the March sky, the same long tables where students gathered to eat and gossip and complain about their homework. But as Harry sat at the Gryffindor table for dinner on his first evening back from the Easter holidays, he felt like he was seeing it all for the first time. The conversations around him had a different quality now. Where once he'd heard the casual chatter of students who trusted that the adults in their world had their best interests at heart, now he detected undercurrents of doubt and questioning that hadn't been there before. The revelation about Sirius Black's innocence and Peter Pettigrew's survival had sent ripples through the entire wizarding world, and Hogwarts had not been immune to the waves. "Did you hear that Professor Binns actually updated his curriculum?" Hermione whispered, leaning closer to Harry and Ron. "He's including a whole section on miscarriages of justice in magical history. Apparently the Board of Governors insisted on it after everything that came out about Sirius." "About time," Ron muttered, stabbing his roast beef with more force than necessary. Maybe now people will stop assuming that everything they're told by authority figures is automatically true. Harry nodded, but his attention was drawn to the staff table, where several seats remained conspicuously empty. Professor McGonagall sat in her usual place, but her expression was more severe than usual, and she kept glancing toward the headmaster's chair with barely concealed frustration. Dumbledore himself was present, but diminished somehow, his usual twinkling demeanor replaced by something more subdued, more careful. The political fallout from the Pettigrew revelation was still reverberating through magical Britain. 3 more ministry officials had resigned in disgrace, and there were persistent rumors that Minister Fudge himself might be forced out before the year was over. But it was Dumbledore's fall from grace that had perhaps been the most shocking to the general public. The man who had been universally revered as the leader of the light was now viewed with suspicion and disappointment by many who had once trusted him implicitly. "Potter," a voice said beside him, and Harry looked up to see Draco Malfoy standing by the Gryffindor table. The Slytherin's usual sneer was absent, replaced by an expression that was almost respectful. "Malfoy," Harry replied warily, waiting for whatever insult or provocation was coming. But instead, Draco glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "I wanted to say, what you did with Black and Pettigrew. My father always told me that our family served the Dark Lord out of conviction. But after everything that's come out," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Maybe some people were just as manipulated as everyone else." He straightened up and walked back to the Slytherin table without another word, leaving Harry staring after him in surprise. "Did Draco Malfoy just thank you?" Ron asked incredulously. "I think he might have," Harry replied, still processing the strange interaction. It wasn't the only conversation like that Harry had experienced since returning to Hogwarts. In the past week, he'd been approached by students from all 4 houses, some expressing gratitude for exposing the truth, others sharing their own stories of times when they'd been told to accept things that didn't feel right. Still others simply wanting to understand how he'd found the courage to challenge Dumbledore himself. "The thing is," Neville Longbottom had said during one such conversation in the common room, "my Gran always told me my parents were heroes, who died fighting you-know-who. But after everything that's come out about how many people knew things they didn't share, I keep wondering what else we haven't been told, what other secrets are being kept for our own good." It was a question that seemed to be on everyone's minds. The comfortable certainty that had once characterized life at Hogwarts had been replaced by a healthy skepticism that Harry found both encouraging and somewhat sad. These students were learning the same lesson he had learned, that adults, even well-meaning ones, were capable of terrible mistakes and deliberate deceptions. But perhaps the most significant change in Harry's life was in his approach to learning itself. Where once he had studied defense against the dark arts because it was required, now he threw himself into it with genuine passion. Not because Dumbledore or anyone else had told him he needed to be prepared for war, but because he had chosen to prepare himself. "You've improved remarkably, Mr. Potter," Professor Lupin observed, after a particularly successful lesson on advanced shielding charms. "Your technique has become much more intentional, I suppose is the word. Less reactive, more controlled." "I'm learning because I want to learn," Harry replied, lowering his wand. "Not because someone else has decided what I need to know." Lupin nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his tired eyes. "That's the most important lesson of all, I think. Knowledge sought freely is always more powerful than knowledge imposed by others." It was a philosophy that had begun to guide all aspects of Harry's life. His friendships with Ron and Hermione had deepened immeasurably, built now on a foundation of shared truth rather than comfortable assumptions. They had faced the most powerful wizard in Britain together, had chosen justice over safety, had supported each other through revelations that shattered their understanding of the world they lived in. "We're going to be all right, you know," Hermione said one evening, as they sat by the fire in the Gryffindor common room, working on homework that felt almost trivial after everything they'd been through. "Whatever comes next, Voldemort's return, more political upheaval, whatever challenges we have to face, we'll handle it together." "Together, and on our own terms," Ron added firmly. "No more letting other people decide what's best for us without asking our opinion first." Harry looked at his friends, really looked at them, and marveled at how much they had all changed in just a few short months. They were still teenagers, still students worried about exams and Quidditch matches, and whether their essays were long enough, but underneath that surface normalcy was a core of steel that hadn't been there before, a determination to think for themselves and stand up for what they believed was right. His relationship with Sirius continued to grow stronger with each letter they exchanged. Each weekend visit Harry was allowed to make to Grimmauld Place. His godfather was healing too, slowly but steadily, learning to live in a world that had changed dramatically during his 12 years in prison. They were both works in progress, both carrying scars that would never fully fade. But they were building something real and lasting together. "The nightmares are getting less frequent," Sirius had written in his most recent letter. "And I've started working with some of the other people who were wrongfully imprisoned over the years. Turns out there are more of us than anyone wants to admit. We're thinking of forming a support group, maybe even pushing for legal reforms to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Your courage in speaking up has inspired a lot of people, Harry, more than you probably realize." The idea that his actions had helped other people find their voices was both humbling and empowering. Harry had never set out to be a leader or an inspiration. He had simply refused to accept injustice when he saw it. But apparently, that refusal had given others permission to question their own assumptions about authority and truth. Even his relationship with his teachers had evolved. Professor McGonagall treated him with a new kind of respect, as if she recognized that he was no longer the malleable child who had first walked into her classroom. Professor Flitwick had begun incorporating more practical applications into his lessons, acknowledging that students needed to know not just how to cast spells, but when and why to use them. Even Snape, still unpleasant and biased, seemed to regard Harry with something that might have been grudging approval for his willingness to challenge authority when necessary. The one relationship that remained complicated was with Dumbledore himself. The headmaster still tried to engage Harry in conversation occasionally, still offered cryptic advice and philosophical observations. But the easy trust that had once existed between them was gone, replaced by a careful distance that felt both necessary and sad. "I do not expect your forgiveness, Harry," Dumbledore had said during one such encounter. "But I hope that someday you will understand that everything I did was motivated by a genuine desire to protect you and the wizarding world." "I understand your motivations, Professor," Harry had replied. "What I can't accept is your methods. Protecting people by lying to them, by manipulating their lives without their consent. That's not protection. That's control." Dumbledore had nodded sadly and walked away without another word. Now, as March gave way to April and the end of the school year approached, Harry found himself thinking about the future with a mixture of anticipation and determination. Voldemort's return was still a looming threat. The prophecy Dumbledore had revealed made that clear. But when that confrontation came, Harry would face it as himself, armed with knowledge he had chosen to seek, and allies he had chosen to trust. One evening, alone in the dormitory while his roommates were at dinner, Harry pulled out the Marauder's map one final time. He spread it across his bed and activated it with the familiar phrase, watching as the lines of ink spread across the parchment to reveal the layout of Hogwarts and the movements of everyone within its walls. But this time, instead of using it to avoid authority figures or find secret passages, Harry simply studied it, really studied it, with new eyes. Each moving dot represented a person with their own hopes and fears, their own secrets and struggles. The map showed where people were, but it couldn't show who they really were beneath the labels it assigned to them. Peter Pettigrew had appeared on this map as Peter Pettigrew, but for years everyone had believed he was dead. Sirius Black had been labelled as a dangerous criminal when he was actually an innocent man driven to desperation. Even Dumbledore appeared on the map simply as Albus Dumbledore, with no indication of the complex motivations and questionable decisions that lay behind that name. The map showed truth, but only surface truth. Real understanding, the kind that mattered, came from looking deeper, asking questions, refusing to accept easy answers just because they came from authority figures. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," Harry had said the first time he activated the map, not knowing that he was making a promise that would change everything. He had been up to no good in the best possible way, questioning authority, exposing lies, refusing to accept injustice. Now, as he folded the map away for the last time, Harry whispered a different phrase: "Mischief managed." The ink faded from the parchment, leaving behind blank paper that looked innocent and unremarkable. But Harry knew better now. He understood that the most powerful magic wasn't always visible, that the most important truths were often hidden, and that real strength came not from blind obedience to authority, but from the courage to think for yourself and stand up for what you knew was right. Tomorrow, he would return to classes. He would study and learn and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. He would write letters to Sirius and spend time with Ron and Hermione and continue building the relationships that mattered to him. But tonight, Harry Potter, no longer the manipulated child who had discovered an impossible name on an enchanted map, but a young man who had learned to question everything and trust his own moral compass, finally understood what it meant to be truly free. The map had shown him that Peter Pettigrew was alive when everyone believed him dead. But more importantly, it had taught him that knowledge was only as valuable as the wisdom to use it well. And wisdom, Harry had learned, came not from accepting what you were told, but from having the courage to discover the truth for yourself. Outside his window, the grounds of Hogwarts stretched away into the darkness, familiar and yet forever changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to choose between comfort and truth. Harry Potter was ready for all of it.